All right. Good evening, everybody. We're going to start right on time, at the top of the hour. This is going to be Tech Thursdays, episode 103. Not a whole lot happening this week. The Game Developers Conference did take place this week. Last week we had GTC. This week we have GDC. So it's interesting how this time of the year has a lot of these trade shows happening in these industry verticals that are relevant to the PC DIY community. So I did want to point that out. I don't know how much we're going to actually talk about GDC unless some of the viewers have anything they want to share. If you attended GDC in person, that's great. Nintendo did have the Nintendo Direct earlier today, this morning, and they announced a bunch of games. They didn't talk about the Switch 2, although they did say that the Switch 2 will have its own special dedicated Nintendo Direct session on April 4th, so that is almost a week from today. So we will learn more about the Switch 2 very soon. That is the new console coming out from Nintendo, slated for this year. It's probably going to come out, I don't know, May or something. Who knows? But it is coming out soon based off of what Nintendo was saying. So other than that, there's not a whole lot to talk about. There is a new motherboard from ASUS that is available. It launches, it's on the screen right now. It is the ROG Crosshair X870 Apex. So the Apex is making a final return in a full ATX form factor for the Zen 5 Ryzen CPUs. So this is going to be a very expensive motherboard from ASUS. It is a overclocker's motherboard. So we may talk a little bit about this. There's not a whole lot to talk about this week. So tech news is very, very light this week. So that's why I was like, well, there's a motherboard that is coming out on April 4th. This motherboard will be available at retail. So if you're someone who is wanting to do overclocking, or like RAM overclocking in particular, this is a 2-DIMM memory motherboard. That is how Apex always is. So for those that don't know, Apex is ASUS's like dedicated overclockers motherboard. Typically these used to be, for a while they were ITX form factor, so it is very nice to see that they've come out with a full ATX form factor for the Apex. Last year they did launch the Z890 version of this motherboard. The only other motherboard that is similar to this in terms of ATX form factor and 2DIMM and overclocker centric with all the knobs is the ASRock. I think ASRock OC. I forget the name of it. OC. It's not Formula. Is it Formula? The ASRock has a motherboard also. I don't know if they're going to come out with one for AMD Ryzen, but they did launch a Z890 for Intel's Core Ultra series last year, alongside the launch of that brand new socket from Intel. But it is nice to see that ASUS is coming out with a Ryzen focus board. Now, you can see one of the things that does look vastly improved versus the Hero is the Gen 5 cooling on this board. The other thing, they do have a picture of, where is it? Yeah, so it does, I don't know if it includes this. Oh yeah, it does include it. So it does come with an active cooling setup for not only the memory, but also it looks like this fan helps with cooling. Well, I don't know, maybe it doesn't help with cooling the Gen 5 SSD, but I do like how they've done that. That's actually really unique. The other thing I like about this board is the X4 slot is at the top, and then the GPU is underneath that, and then there's an X1 open slot, and the X4 slot is also open. And then they have a, what looks like it's probably an X8 slot at the bottom. So you can do dual graphics cards with this. If you have dual slot graphics cards, you can actually fit all those, plus still use the X4 and the X1 PCIe slot. So this motherboard is actually very versatile, surprisingly so. It also has the DIMM.2 makes a return for SSDs that vertically mount to a actual, looks like a RAM slot. They call it a DIMM.2. It's not a RAM slot. It is a custom ASUS connector that is designed for M.2 drives. So it looks like that is also included. So pretty high-end flagship motherboard. from ASUS for overclockers. But even if you're not an overclocker, it does seem like it does have a lot of practical usage. It has the DIMM.2, it has a Gen 5, a thick Gen 5 heatsink. It also has the RAM fan for active cooling of the memory. So this is the type of motherboard that is designed, I think, to push memory in excess of like 8400 megatransfers, 8600 megatransfers, etc. That kind of thing. So it's definitely for extreme overclocking. So interesting motherboard. How does it compare to the Taichi? Well, this is a lot more expensive than the Taichi. This is a 2-DIMM motherboard. So it is meant for overclocking right off the bat. Like, just by looking at it, I can tell it's for overclockers. So it's not for people who are trying to build a mini HEDT workstation or any of that kind of thing. However, the interesting thing about it is because of the way they position the PCIe slots, this is actually usable as like a workstation PC or a workstation motherboard. The only drawback is the 2-DIMM memory. Like, because you can't run 4 sticks of memory, typically people that are building desktops for work, they typically need 4 memory DIMMs. Viegas, thanks for the sub. So, but I mean, it's got all the debug things, except I don't think it has a speaker because ASUS doesn't have those on their boards. It does have the full backplate, Wi-Fi 7, USB 4. It's got a whole bunch of, another thing too that makes it prove that it's like an overclocker's board. It has a PS by 2. It has a PS by 2. I thought there was a picture of the back of it. I don't know why. I thought there was a better one. But it has a PS by 2 port. You don't see that very often. I think it also has it probably has that disconnect thing that can scratch the PCIe slots. It probably has that. So yeah, I see the question from Super Googly about the scratching the PCIe. It probably scratches the PCIe. I don't know. Only ASUS can answer that. It's not that big of a deal, to be honest, although it is kind of annoying. My A380 has a scratch on it from the second slot, and then I think my Red Devil also has a small, slight scratch on it, but that's a heavier graphics card. But both cards still work, so I don't know. It's more like a cosmetic thing. But definitely, if you don't like the fact that the ASUS boards could do that, you're probably going to not want to go with ASUS boards until they revise that. But I have a feeling it has the same drawback that the ASUS boards have. So let's see, how's everybody doing? I guess I should have asked you guys that at the start instead of diving right into this motherboard, but that seems to be the thing that we talk about on this channel is motherboards. All the new X870 are updated. They're new. Oh, is there another one? So there's another one. There's a BTF one. So ASUS is coming out with a BTF in the TUF series. So the TUF is getting a BTF. You can see it here. That is very interesting that they're doing BTF on a more budget-friendly motherboard line. So they also have this really weird connector over here. I don't know what this is. But yeah, they're doing BTF on TUF. So that is interesting. It has lots of USB. So that is cool to see that happen. And it's a white motherboard too. So if you're trying to do an all white build, that would fit really well. Now you have an option for a white motherboard that's also BTF form factor. The only challenge with BTF is like the case has to also support BTF. Most standard cases, they don't support BTF. So that's the biggest problem with BTF right now. It's not so much finding a motherboard option. Assuming you can find a motherboard, the problem is actually the case. Because not a lot of cases support BTF. Which was black like the prototype. I think there's probably going to be an ROG BTF, which will be a black one. So yeah, I don't know. What is this thing? Because that's, that is interesting. I don't know what that is. But yeah, the heatsink for the SSD does not look good though. Like that doesn't look like that's not adequate for Gen 5. Just straight up like that. The other one was a lot better. This one, no. But yeah, that is cool to see that ASUS is making more of the BTF form factor. I still think we're not really there yet until I see compelling cases that support BTF. I will probably hold off on like trying to get a BTF motherboard until there's some really good cases that support it. But yeah, these are two. So we got a tough BTF, and there's also the Apex is coming back. So those are the two boards. The Apex will be on sale April. It'll be available for purchase on April 4th from Newegg. So if you want one of these, like if you're an overclocker and you want a 2DIMM full ATX motherboard that is actually usable for like PCIe slots, this is actually a pretty good one. This looks like a pretty good board. The one thing that has also been rumored is the ROG Crosshair X870E Extreme. So there are listings that appear in Europe suggesting €1,200 plus price point. So at CES, ASUS unveiled their Elite Tier Crosshair Apex. I didn't even know that was shown off at CES. I only learned about it this week. Early January press material teased another contender, ROG Crosshair X870E Extreme. So the Extreme is always their highest end board, and this is not the Extreme, guys. This is the Hero. So forget about that picture. But the thing is, there are, I guess, listings about a Crosshair Extreme. Remember, the ASUS Extreme is the $1,000 or more motherboard, and it is also Extreme with an E, not an X. So remember, it's E with it's Extreme with an E. Gigabyte is the one that does Extreme with no E. So it's Extreme starting with X if it's a Gigabyte. If it's an ASUS, it has the full word properly spelled with the E for Extreme. So just keep that in mind. So it's like, don't get confused, because there is also the Gigabyte Aorus Extreme with an X AI top, which is Gigabyte's highest end motherboard. But ASUS looks like there are leaks that there is going to be an Extreme from ASUS. This, if so, this will become the new flagship motherboard from ASUS for the Zen 5 CPUs. So this is the sort of motherboard that ASUS is designing to be paired up with something like a 9950X3D. Like that is the sort of CPU that you would pair up with the Extreme. At the very least, it would be a 9950X, if not the 9950X3D. Because why spend all that money on a motherboard if you're not going to have a flagship CPU? That doesn't make any sense. So this, I don't know what exactly it'll have that makes it Extreme other than an Extreme price tag. And it will probably have the customizable LCD screen thing that you can load custom GIFs or whatever. So that's probably going to be on there as well. And then it'll also probably have a whole bunch of expandability. I expect it'll be very, very similar to ASUS's previous X670E Extreme, which means it'll also be very similar to MSI's Godlike in terms of how large it is and the kind of like gimmicks that it comes with. So stuff like that. I think the Extreme is going to be very similar to the MSI Godlike. ASUS Crosshair Extreme is yes, it is the same level as Godlike. That is correct. They're both $100. Well, they're both $1,000 plus motherboards. At 1K for a board, might as well grab. Yeah, I know. That's what I'm saying. Like, I mean, think about it like this, guys. People who are gonna buy this motherboard, they're not gonna think about like how much the CPU is gonna cost. They're gonna get the highest end CPU that they can get to pair it up with this high-end motherboard. Like, I mean, it's that simple, right? Like, no one's gonna put a 9600X or a 9700X or even a 9800X 3D in this motherboard. Like, that doesn't make any sense. Like, why would you get a Ryzen 7 to go with a $1,000 motherboard when you could get a Ryzen 9 and get the exact same gaming performance and much, much better productivity performance? So, yeah, it's kind of a no-brainer. This is meant for Ryzen 9 CPUs. It'll be cool if this comes out, because I do kind of think it was weird that currently MSI has the most expensive motherboard with a Godlike, and I was like, man, ASUS has really left a gap in their portfolio, because like MSI has the full stack and ASUS is like, you know, like it topped out at Crosshair Hero, which is good. Hero's a really good board, but I'm like, man, like where's the Extreme, ASUS? Like you got to do an Extreme. So hopefully this thing does show up. It's kind of like a Halo tier product. It's just kind of there to show people we are ASUS, we are the Republic of Gamers, we're the industry leader, that kind of thing. It will resupplant ASUS as kind of like the leader in the motherboard manufacturer hierarchy, if you will. So, because currently it's weird how MSI has the Godlike, and it's like the Godlike is just kind of there. It's super expensive, and there's like nothing else. And then like there's a whole bunch of like $700 boards, like the Hero, the Extreme AI Top. MSI is supposedly rumored to do an Ace. The Ace is MSI's $700 board. So, you know, ASRock also is kind of like missing in action when it comes to $700 boards, because ASRock is missing the Aqua for liquid cooling on the VRM. And also, ASRock doesn't have the equivalent to the Apex. Like, they have it on Intel last year for the Z890, but they haven't launched an ASRock overclocker board for the AMD stuff, like for the Zen 5 CPUs. So hopefully we'll see some more interesting boards come from ASRock. Gigabyte, I kind of want to see a Tachyon. I think there is a Tachyon. So the Tachyon is the equivalent to Apex. So actually, that brings up a good segment here to talk about this in Paint. So we're going to actually bring out Paint pretty early in the stream. So just to give people an idea, so you have ASUS, you have Gigabyte, MSI, and ASRock. So you have the four major, we're not going to talk about BioStar, no offense to BioStar, but they just don't really have a full stack in terms of their product offerings. So ASUS has the Crosshair Extreme, then they have the Crosshair Apex, then they have the Crosshair Hero. These are known as the flagship. This is like the cream of the crop. This is like the best of the best from ASUS. If your motherboard says Crosshair, that means that it is basically a flagship motherboard. Like, if it doesn't say Crosshair, it's not a flagship motherboard. It doesn't matter if it says ROG. ROG doesn't mean that you have a flagship board. Crosshair means you have a flagship board, because all three of these fall under the ROG family. But you know what also falls under the ROG family? Strix. Strix, specifically, there is the Dash E. Then there, under that, there is the Dash A, I think. And then there is the Strix Dash F. I forget which one is higher end, F or A. I don't, maybe F is higher than A. I always forget. But it's always confusing to me, because out of these two I just kind of ignore. The Dash E is the best one. The Dash E is always the best out of the Strix. But all the Crosshairs are far superior to the Strix. So F is over A. Okay, that's what I thought. Yeah. It sounds weird, right? Like Dash A. Like A is supposed to be like the first letter of the alphabet, yet it's like the worst one out of the Strix boards. So kind of weird. So you got Strix, and then you have Tough, and then you have Prime. So those are the ASUS. Oh, I forgot about ProArt. ProArt is kind of like equal to Strix or so. It's like somewhere in, I don't know. Where should we put? I guess we'll put ProArt like here because of its price point. But it's kind of like with Strix in a way. It's a different brand, different segment from Strix. It's definitely meant for professionals. It's not meant for gamers. Strix is meant for gamers. ProArt is meant for like professionals. And then Tough and Prime are just kind of like down there. So, you know, these are like the entry level. And then you have Strix for the gamers, although gamers oftentimes will buy Tough as well. And we'll just kind of put them like this. We'll just put them like that. So this is the ASUS product stack. So you have Crosshair at the top. You have ProArt, then Strix, then Tough, then Prime. So so that people know, this is how you determine the hierarchy. Because a lot of people have asked me questions about like, well, where does ProArt, or like, I've often got the question like ProArt or Hero. Should I get a ProArt or should I get a Hero? And I'm thinking like, you're comparing a flagship with like a non-flagship. You know what I'm saying? Like, but you know, it's no fault of the individual asking the question. It's just that they don't know. They don't know the hierarchy, but this is the hierarchy. So if you have a Crosshair, congratulations, because you have a flagship ASUS board. And the ASUS boards for AMD this generation are actually very, very good. They are probably one of my most recommended in terms of the brands for this generation. So compared to some of the other ones, which we'll talk about later. But yeah, the ASUS Crosshair is really, really good, guys. You guys saw, we've been live streaming with the Crosshair Hero with the RX 9070 XT and the 9950 X3D. That is currently my favorite computer that I've built in a long time. 4 sticks of memory running at 6400 with a 9950 X3D with the 9070 XT. It is so good. FSR4, so good. So if you guys are curious in what I'm talking about, tune into some of the weekend live streams when we do gaming coverage, because that's when you'll get to see the Crosshair Hero in action. But for right now, this is Tech Thursday, so let's continue on. So Gigabyte. Gigabyte does not have a direct competitor to the Extreme. Instead, they have Aorus Tachyon. I think that's how you spell it. Tachyon competes with the Apex. Then they have the Aorus Extreme AI Top, which is weird, but I think Tachyon is lower priced than Extreme. But I'm trying to draw a direct comparison between ASUS and Gigabyte. Just so you guys know, the Apex is an overclocker's motherboard. In fact, all of the Crosshair motherboards are overclocker motherboards. However, the Apex is like let's say the optimal choice for an overclocker because it's a 2-DIMM memory motherboard. So it's very, very easy to overclock memory on the Apex versus the others. Now that changes a little bit. That advantage is kind of diminished compared to other Crosshairs because the Hero and the Extreme, assuming the Extreme will exist, they have something called Nitro Path, which makes it so that those two boards function almost as good, not quite as good, but a lot more closer to a 2-DIMM motherboard when overclocking the RAM. We are judging by, well, we're judging by MSRP, but we're also judging by like how it directly compares. But yeah, technically the Gigabyte Extreme was never meant to compete with the Hero. It was meant to compete with the ASUS Extreme. The problem is ASUS increased the price of all their boards over the last 2 generations of CPUs, that now it pushed like Gigabyte's AI Top down, so to speak, to compete with Hero, because Hero used to be a lower priced board and now it's just as expensive as the AI Top. And that's the reason why now it compares with AI Top when it used to compare with the next motherboard here, which is the Aorus Master. So you have Tachyon, you have Extreme, AI Top, and then you have Master. And then from there, technically, the Master competes with the Dash E Strix now because of the price point. But we're just going to leave it there. And then under that, you have Aorus Elite. I think this is correct. And then Aorus Pro, or maybe Aorus Pro. Pro, and then Elite. I always get these two mixed up. I always, just like how I get Strix-F and -A mixed up, I often get the Elite and the Pro mixed up from Gigabyte. But yeah, this is the hierarchy. And then from there, you have the Gaming X series. And then you have something called Eagle. You have Eagle down at the bottom. So this is the Gigabyte hierarchy of motherboards. Now, you could put the Extreme above the Tachyon, because I think the Tachyon is not as expensive as the Extreme, which makes a lot of sense, because the Extreme is supposed to be, like, the word Extreme, it's supposed to be the most extreme. So I kind of want to flip these two, but I don't want to confuse people, because the Tachyon is a 2-DIMM motherboard, just like the Apex. And the Extreme AI Top is a $700 flagship, just like the Crosshair Hero, which is also a $700 flagship. So that's why I'm just going to leave it like this. But you guys can keep in mind that the Extreme AI Top, this is meant to be the highest end board from Gigabyte. Not the Tachyon. The Tachyon is an overclocker specific board because it's a 2-DIMM board. Next we have MSI. Everybody knows by now the MSI. MSI has something called MEG. MSI Enthusiast Gaming. The Godlike is their highest end board. And it is called MEG, which is known as the MSI Enthusiast Gaming Godlike. That is the full name. The MSI X870E MSI Enthusiast Gaming Godlike. That is the full name of that motherboard. But we always call it MEG Godlike because I don't like saying MSI Enthusiast Gaming Godlike. That's like a super long name. All right, and then they have the Ace. The MEG Ace is the one right below the Godlike. Now it's weird because they don't have to my knowledge, they don't have a 2-DIMM overclocker board. So I kind of want to leave a space here because I like to put the 2-DIMM board here, and there isn't one. So we're just going to leave it like that. Then they have, Ace is their $700 board. So this is equal to the Hero and the Extreme AI Top in terms of the price point. So then next we have the MPG. This is the MSI Performance Gaming Carbon. We'll just say Carbon. I don't want to write Wi-Fi. But you guys know the Carbon, this is their, what I call their $500 board, which is equal to the Aorus Master and the ProArt and the Strix-E in terms of its position. So the true rival to this would be a Strix-E and an Aorus Master. Those are the rivals. And then we have one from ASRock, which we're going to talk about later. So the MPG, MSI Performance Gaming, and then I think they have like a white version of that. There's also the MPG Edge, which is underneath the Carbon. And then I think after that you have the MAG. So then you have MAG, which is the MSI, I don't know what the A is. I'm forgetting what that stands for. It's like something, Arsenal. I think it's Arsenal. MSI Arsenal Gaming, which is basically like their lower tier. The Tomahawk sits at the top of the MAG series. So you got MSI Enthusiast Gaming, MSI Performance Gaming, MSI, I think Arsenal, if I'm not mistaken. MSI Arsenal Gaming. So you have the Tomahawk, and then there's like a MAG Pro or something like that, or I don't know what that. There's like a Pro. I know that there's like some kind of Pro series, and then there's another one that I'm forgetting. But anyway, that's pretty much the majority of it. So they got 2 MAGs, 2 MPGs, and 2 MAGs. So that's the MSI lineup, and then we have ASRock. ASRock, typically they would have the Aqua. The Aqua, it's missing in action for X870 right now. Then they have the Tai Chi. Then they have their Phantom Gaming. So specifically here, this is actually further down. Is that right? Man, ASUS is throwing me off because it's like I need to shift these around a little bit. But they have Phantom Gaming, and then they have Steel, Legend, and then they've got another one. They've got Pro RS or something like that. I think that's right. Riptide and Nova are part of Phantom Gaming, for those wondering. So that's kind of the ASRock stack. So they've got Aqua. This is the one that has the liquid cool. Oh, I think they also have the Formula. Is it ASRock? Formula OC? Or what is it? Yeah, OC Formula. OC Formula. Is that right? That sounds about right. Actually, no, hold on. This needs to go above Aqua. That's where it needs to go. That sounds right. So you have OC Formula, Aqua, Tai Chi, although the price, I mean this is also kind of like wrong, but this needs to go up, I think. Something like that? Yeah, that sounds better. That looks better. So yeah. OC Formula, Aqua, Tai Chi, Phantom Gaming, Steel Legend, Pro RS. So there you go. That is the hierarchy. So you can see how they're kind of all stacked. So the one that I think needs to do a better job with their product positioning is ASRock. Because I think a lot of people don't understand, like, half the people that watch, like, the tier list video, they don't understand, like, it's like, why is the Nova so good? Well, the Nova technically is lower end than the Tai Chi. The Nova sits in the Phantom Gaming line. You can think of Phantom Gaming as the equivalent to, like, Strix. Strix, Phantom Gaming, and then you've got MPG, I guess. And then you have these parts of Aorus. It's weird because Aorus has like AI top now, which is like another, this is like a whole nother sub brand that they invented last year. So that, it's kind of like, I kind of see like what ASUS or what Gigabyte's doing is Aorus used to be like the competitor to, I think they were trying to compete with Crosshair, but then they like changed it and they're like, okay, we're going to open it up. It's going to be like all of ROG, which are these boards. So I guess like AI top is designed to compete with these, and then like non-AI top Aorus boards are supposed to compete with these. Like, I think that's what they're doing. It's kind of hard because I feel like ASUS's positioning is very well understood. There's clear delineations, you know, between like products. You know what I'm saying? Like, there's clear delineations. There's a little bit of overlap because like price on some of these overlaps, price on these overlaps. So you got some overlaps at the boundaries between brand or between segments on ASUS. You don't really see that with Gigabyte or MSI or ASRock. They're all very clearly different in price. So it's like you got your $500 board or your $450 board. You have your $300 line. You have your sub 300 to 200 something line. Then you have your like 200 or lower. So is the MPG Edge the best white AM5 board? Yeah, it's funny you mentioned ASRock. ASRock, last generation, they did have a white Tai Chi, although it was like a marble white. So they had the Carrera. I think it was like Tai Chi Carrera. It was like a white motherboard. They don't have that this generation, though. The ASUS proprietary connector to power the GPU. Oh, that means you gotta buy like a specific GPU from ASUS to go in the BTF motherboard? Nova doesn't have a synchronous clock generator while Tai Chi does. Yeah, I know. That's why That's the reason why Taichi's higher end. Nova is here. Taichi is here. Taichi sits above the... But yeah, that's another reason why the Taichi is higher end. Basically, ASRock draws the line here. These boards have clock generator. These boards do not have clock generator. X870 have that, while X870A doesn't have it. Okay, so that's the... Okay, so basically, these boards have clock generator. These boards don't have clock generator. Actually, you bring up a good point mentioning that. I don't know what the price of the Dash F is. This might be the cheapest option that gets you external E-clock if you want to do base clock overclocking. The Strix Dash F might be the lowest priced board that offers that. The asynchronous E-clock. Oh, it's 400. 400 is not really cheap. But yeah, that is... okay, that's like $50 less than the Taichi. So in that scenario, I don't know, man. Taichi is actually a really good board. This is 450. So for $50 more, you get an EATX. Dash F does not have the postcode debug. If I remember correctly, the Taichi does have the postcode debug. So I don't know. I'd probably go with the Taichi if I had to choose between those two. The Taichi, basically, okay, here's my opinion. For most people, having evaluated so many motherboards over the last 2 years, I've come to the conclusion that 95% of all people who build computers, build custom desktops for themselves, they would be well served with anything below this line. This is where I draw the line. Meaning, every motherboard in this rectangle covers the use case for 95% of all the people that are building their own PC. The motherboards that exist outside of this rectangle, so we're talking like the Crosshairs, the Megs, the Extreme AI Top, and some boards from ASRock that are currently not even available for Ryzen. They're not really necessary for almost like everyone. Meaning, in order for you to fall into that 5% that actually needs one of the more expensive boards, these super high-end boards, you need to have a very, very specific use case to justify purchasing these boards. For example, the Apex, the Tachyon, and the OC Formula. These are 2-DIMM overclocking motherboards. They have custom switches for like slow mode boot and all this stuff that only people who are going to be doing extreme overclocking, so we're talking dry ice or a chiller or LN2, those type of people that are doing that as a hobby, they would be the ones who these 3 motherboards are designed for. Like the Tachyon, the Apex, and the Formula are built for those type of individuals. They're not meant for a guy or a girl who wants to build a computer just to play Apex Legends or League of Legends or Monster Hunter Wilds. Those boards are not meant for those type of people. Just saying, right? Oh, thanks for mentioning the Unify. Thanks for mentioning the Unify. That was what I was missing. I knew MSI. I couldn't remember the name. Thank you for reminding me of the Unify. Yes. The Unify is MSI's overclocker 2-DIMM motherboard. So all 4 of these boards are tailor-made for extreme overclockers. Those are the motherboards meant for overclocking. You want to push memory to 8400, 8600, maybe 9000 plus. Those 4 motherboards are the motherboards that are designed to overclock the RAM that fast, because they have the least amount of electrical noise, because they don't have the 2 empty DIMM slots acting as antennas that are amplifying noise. So that's just one of the reasons why the 2 DIMM boards are meant for overclockers. But anyway, you guys get the point that I'm making, is that Tachyon, Apex, Unify, and Formula are meant for overclockers. So unless you're an extreme overclocker, these motherboards are probably not for you. So just saying. So but they exist for a specific audience, for a specific use case. So that's why, let's remove the square, I guess. And let's put back the MSI Unify. Yeah, the Unify. I knew they had one. I was like, I can't remember the name. So yeah, anyway. So they all have their 2 DIMM boards. So the ProArt. So, okay, let me draw the line again. The top end, right under the line. So I kind of want to ignore the ProArt for a second, because technically the Dash E is the one that I really want to include here. So the Dash E, the Master, the Carbon, and the Taichi, these are all the, what I call, I can't really say flagship, but they're what I consider the flagship for most regular people who are building PCs. So, meaning the Dash E is kind of as far as someone would spend. That's $500 for a motherboard from ASUS. The Dash E is a $500 board. The Master from Gigabyte is a $500 motherboard. The MPG Carbon Wi-Fi from MSI is a $500 motherboard. Taichi is $450. So it's like it's in the same, roughly speaking, Taichi is kind of in the same ballpark. It's like the highest end board that ASRock has, close to that $500 price point. So, for all intents and purposes, those 4 boards, Dash E, Master, Carbon, Taichi, they are the flagship for most people. Like, most people would probably never consider spending $500 on a motherboard, if we're being honest. But if they want a super high-end board and they feel like they can spend $500 or they want to spend $500 on a board, those are the motherboards that are meant for those people. Now, these motherboards, Dash E, Master, Carbon, Taichi, they will fulfill almost like everything that you could possibly need the motherboard to do, except for a few exceptions. Some of them don't have, well, actually, all of them don't have 10 gig LAN, for one thing. But they all have the debug tools, like the postcode debug. They all have, typically they have like 4 or 5 M.2 slots, depending on the board. Some of them have lane sharing, some of them don't have lane sharing. Actually, all of them have lane sharing except the Taichi to some capacity. The Taichi does have an X8 slot. Some of them have the X8 slot. The Taichi has the X8 slot. I think the Carbon also has the X8 slot, if I'm not mistaken. The Master does not, or no, it does not. It does not have the X8 slot. So, and neither does the Dash E. So it's kind of like a hit or miss in terms of you really need to know what you're going to do with your computer before you just choose a motherboard, because it's like the motherboard is a very, very important part of the build, so to speak, because the motherboard will ultimately determine what you can and cannot do with your computer. Like if you want dual graphics cards, you typically want a motherboard that has the X8 slot. You know, things like that. A lot of people don't think about this. They just randomly buy a board, and then later on they want to do something, and they find out, oh, they can't do it because their motherboard doesn't support it. So, stuff like that. Who needs unutilized 10 gig? People who have a home network on a 10 gig network, or someone who wants to run a 10 gig interface directly to a NAS storage in their home. I mean, there's lots of people that could use the 10 gig. 2.5 gig is enough for internet. We're not talking about internet, guys. See, a lot of people misunderstand like what the 10 gig is for. The 10 gig interface is not meant for internet. No one's running 10 gig internet. Honestly, I don't know of anyone who's running 10 gig internet speed. I'm talking about the home network being on a 10 gig LAN connected environment where you have a a home NAS. If you don't have a NAS, maybe you have a file server or something that's all locally there. So if you want to be able to access that and do transfers, 10 gig is extremely fast to do file transfers compared to like 2.5. So there are use cases and advantages of having a 10 gig home network. But those use cases are very, very small in terms of the vast majority of people. And that's the reason why I'm saying that 95% of the people who build computers, they don't need these motherboards that are above the line, because, you know, like, unless you really want the 10 gig, unless you want dual graphics cards, that kind of thing, these other motherboards are more than sufficient for most of everyone who's building a PC. Anything above those boards need to spend greater than 500. So, well, okay, 10 gig, you can get 10 gig with the ProArt. $480 for 10 gig from ASUS. But you don't get debug. No postcode debug with the ProArt. So I find that very weird that ASUS is charging almost $500 for a professional motherboard, and it doesn't even have like onboard diagnostic postcode. It's like, what? That is a huge oversight from ASUS. But that's my biggest criticism of that board, because at that price point, there is no excuse to not include the 7-segment debug display. So that is unexcusable on the ProArt. So that's why I don't recommend the ProArt. For anyone who's trying to do like a workstation, I recommend either it depends on what you're doing. If you want dual GPU, the Taichi is a better choice. Also, if you want 10 gig LAN, you kind of need to step up to the AI Top. You don't have to, but the AI Top is going to offer a better board than the ProArt. I mean, it also has dual GPU capability. So it's like there's better choices, but it's almost like there's an upsell option that exists for anytime you start talking about these niche one-off use cases like, oh, 10 gig LAN or dual graphics card. It's like, oh, there's a board, but it's like ASUS would be more than happy. Oh, you need the debug diagnostic? Well, I guess you're going to have to step up to the Hero, but it doesn't have 10 gig LAN. I mean, that's a huge misstep on the $700 board. So I don't know. ASUS has a lot of like weird, like ASUS is charging $500 for a ProArt with no onboard diagnostic. Then they sell a $700 Hero with no 10 gig LAN. Like, I don't understand how they do that, man. That's like, I don't know. That's weird. You really want to spend $700 on a board and not get 10 gig LAN, even if you're not going to use it? So, I don't know. That's just weird. Don't forget B850 AI Top has dual. Are you serious? The B850 has dual 10 gig LAN? Oh man, what? I don't even know what that's priced at. That is hilarious. That's hilarious. the B850 AI Top has dual 10 gig LAN. It's an X870 minus USB 4 and okay. Yeah, all of these boards have USB 4, guys. Just FYI. Even the Eagle has USB 4. The Prime has USB 4. That's standard equipment on X870E. Because everything we're talking about here is X870 or X870E. And that's standard. Wi-Fi 7 and USB 4 is standard. Isn't the Pro above the Elite? I don't know. Maybe. It costs more than the Elite? Okay, well then it's supposed to be above the Elite. So then that's a mistake. So, let's delete these. And then okay, so it's Aorus Pro, Aorus Elite. Yeah, that sounds right. There. Okay, so then so it's the same thing that I messed up with the Dash F and the Dash A. Well, okay, the problem with B850, and this is the reason why I don't really recommend B850. If someone is looking at B850, I would strongly recommend they consider X870. Not X870E, just X870. Because B850, I feel like you end up in a situation where you constantly have to analyze, like, every single little detail about the B850 board to make sure it does something the way you want it to, because there's too much compromise with B850. Like, oh, it doesn't have USB 4. Oh, this one does have USB 4. Oh, this one has 10 gig but doesn't have this, or it's like only two, or the M.2s are like at 2 lanes or whatever. So it's like there's so many like compromises made with B850, which is the reason why I don't really like to talk about B850. Every now and then someone will say something like, oh, like the dual 10 gig on a B850. Well, it's like, okay, that's impressive, but I still don't know who needs that, because like, what are you going to do with a dual 10 gig B850 board? Like, it doesn't have as much storage capacity. I mean, unless you're buying like super expensive 8 terabyte SSDs or whatever, like, and then it's like, okay, at that point, if you're considering buying those expensive SSDs, like, why not just get a more expensive motherboard from the start? You see what I'm saying? So it's like, it's like we said earlier, like, no one's gonna buy a Crosshair Extreme or a Meg Godlike and put a Ryzen 5 9600X in there. Like, that's not how it works. But yeah, this is I just kind of wanted to paint this picture so that people have an idea of the hierarchy of the boards. You got the X870 Elite. Well, you got to remember also, like, what you're comparing. So when you say Master or a Nova, Master and Nova are not the same level. Nova is lesser. It's a lesser board than the Master. The Master is equivalent from ASRock is the Taichi. So it'd be more like you want to get a Master or a Carbon or a Taichi or a Dash E. Those are the 4. If you're considering Nova, then that's gonna be more like an Edge or a Pro. Well, you already have the Pro, so technically, oh no, you have the Elite. I see. So, or this. That is what Nova competes with. So Nova is more comparable to like an MPG Edge or an Aorus Pro or a Dash F. The problem is the Nova looks like so good in terms of value compared to these other boards, which is the reason why it's like, man, it's kind of tough to compete against the Nova. Because, well, we don't need to go there. We've already talked about the Nova enough on this channel. But anyone considering the Nova, I mean, you're pretty much buying the Nova for a reason at this point. Yeah, the reason why they can do that is because they're not offering USB 4. Is would I have any good... Okay, the graphics card doesn't matter. That's irrelevant. The MSI X870 Tomahawk and a 9950X3D. I don't see anything wrong with that. You got X870E Elite for $250 on sale. If I were to go up, then based off that value, Nova. Yeah, the Nova is like... It's just kind of there, man. It's just kind of sitting there, like... It's kind of like you can't really... Like, the other motherboards just kind of avoid it, because it's like... Anytime you start talking about the Nova, it's kind of like it's... You can't really bring up the other brands. It's like very hard to... It's very hard to compete with the Nova. You replace ROG Strix F... Wait, B650... B650E-F... And replace it with the Nova... If you're doing that because you need the extra connectivity. Because I see no reason to change motherboards mid-generation unless you really, really need the connectivity that the dual chipset offers. Nova just says hello. Goodbye. I know, man. Like all the boards that are kind of like in that any motherboard that's like from the price of like $300 to like $450 is like in really, really bad shape compared to the Nova. Like, dude, like what? I could sit here and like tell people why the Nova is S tier like all day. Is it worth going from the Nova to the Apex? Okay, if you're asking that question, do we need to ask you? Do we need to survey you on like, are you an extreme overclocker? Like the basic question is, are you an extreme overclocker? If not, then why are you thinking of getting the Apex? Like that's my question. Because the Apex is meant for extreme overclocking. I mean, you can use it for like a gaming computer. I mean, it's fine. Like if you're gonna cap out at like 96 gigs of RAM, you're not gonna be able to run more than 96 gigs at like 6400 or whatever. But who knows? Maybe once they get higher, looser, like DDR5-8000 with dual rank, maybe that'll be a better investment, but I don't know. I think the Nova, man, is just unbeatable in terms of value. Like none of the boards can really compete with the Nova. If you're considering if you have a Nova or you're considering the Nova, and then you're comparing the Nova to any of these other boards that are way more expensive, then the question that I have is, do you actually need the things that these motherboards offer that the Nova does not offer? Those are the questions that you have to be able to answer. If you can't answer those questions, you should not change boards. Or you should just get the Nova if you don't have the Nova. I mean, and it's available in your area. It's that easy. Just asking proves you're not an overclocker. Yeah, I mean, that's what I'm thinking, you know, like, I'm not trying to be rude or anything. I'm just saying, like, these boards are tailor-made for overclockers. Overclockers, extreme overclockers, aren't even going to think. They're not even going to ask the question, should I get the Nova or should I get the... No, they're not even going to think. They're just going to buy the Apex. They're not even going to question. There's no question. There's no OC formula. It's not on AMD. This generation, at least not right now. So ASRock's completely missing in action when it comes to overclockers. So no serious overclocker is going to consider ASRock until they get an overclocker board out. It's that simple. MSI also, overclockers aren't going to consider MSI. You know why? There's no Unify on Ryzen, considering we're talking about Ryzen. Now, if you're on Intel, it's a whole different story because they have those boards. But it's basically get the Apex. I don't know if there's a new Tachyon. I think I know there's an X670 Tachyon. I don't know if there's an X870 Tachyon. But the Apex is basically the overclocker's choice at this point. So let me rephrase this one more time. If you're considering putting your CPU under LN2 or a chiller, or at the very least dry ice, because that's actually relatively easy to do, the Apex is the board. I mean, it's that simple. I mean, technically, I guess you could get the Tai Chi or the Hero. I don't really know why, but you could do that. But yeah, those are the overclocker boards. Does the Tai Chi have any features that the Nova doesn't have? Yes, it does. That's why it's more expensive. So if you need the features that the Tai Chi offers, then you get the Tai Chi. The Tai Chi is a higher end board than the Nova, which means that it has things that the Nova does not have. So if you need those features, then you would get the Tai Chi. But the answer is yes, it has. I can think of at least three things that it has that the Nova doesn't have. That name from Giga, and there's probably more, but we're not going to talk about that right now, unless you guys want to. The name from Gigabyte sounds tacky. You got the Hero and the 9800X3D, but only because the Apex wasn't available at the time. Are you an extreme overclocker? Now, let me say one thing. So one thing I will say about the Hero. If you're an overclocker, extreme overclocker, The Hero is still a good board for extreme overclocking. You know why? Because it has something called Nitro Path. Nitro Path is a technology that ASUS has a patent on, so it's kind of like an ASUS exclusive, and it's only available on the Hero. And assuming ASUS will the Extreme into existence at some point in the future, the Extreme will also have Nitro Path technology. But the Apex does not have Nitro Path technology because it doesn't need it. The Nitro Path is a feature that allows a 4-DIM motherboard to reduce the electrical noise from the empty memory sticks. So if you have 4 memory sticks, A1, A2, well, let's just say, those are some really wide memory sticks. A1, A2, B1, B2. These are the 4 memory sticks. They're really, really thick. And then here's the CPU over here. So when you have the DIM in A2, B2, and you have nothing in the empty A1, B1. So in this scenario, there is going to be a little bit of electrical noise from the 2 empty DIMMs. What ASUS did is they lowered the height, or they reshaped the connectors that grip on to the memory pins on the DIMMs so that it reduces the electrical noise, the crosstalk, if you will. Think of it like having a circuit or think of it like an antenna. Think of like an antenna which will amplify noise on the wire. So by using NitroPath, they reduce that noise.
Do you think my X670E can carry me until AM6 comes out?
Absolutely it can. So especially because you have the Meg Ace. So the MSI Ace is a very, very future-proof motherboard in the sense that it has PCIe Gen 5 on every single PCIe slot, including the bottom PCIe slot. So that is a good board that if I had the Ace, yeah, I would probably stick with it all the way until the end of AM5. There isn't really much of a reason for you to swap. I can think of 2 things that you are missing out on by being on X670E, but those may not even matter to you. One of them is Wi-Fi 7, but let's be honest, most people that are building desktop gaming PCs are going to be using an Ethernet cable. They're not going to be using Wi-Fi, even if it's Wi-Fi 7. So I don't think that's a huge miss. So you're not really missing much on Wi-Fi 7. The other thing is you would have to have a Wi-Fi 7 router. You'd have to have a Wi-Fi 7 infrastructure in place. So, so Wi-Fi 7, you don't get that on X670E. And the other thing that you don't get is, and you probably already know this, is USB 4, because the Meg Ace does not have USB 4, the X670E. So that is just because USB 4 came out like around the time that the X670E was launching to the market, and they were supposed to have USB 4. Now, I've told this story before in a previous live stream, but USB 4 was supposed to be on, or at least available with the launch of X670E back in 2022. But we all know the history that happened there. What happened was, as media had a supply shortage delay, this was all due to the everyone's going to blame the pandemic for the supply shortages, but the story goes that as media was delayed in getting the volume needed to go alongside the launch of AM5. And this is also true, but not so relevant for Intel's Z790 launch, because they launched in the exact same year. But the reason why it didn't affect Intel was because Intel wasn't planning on offering as media USB 4 on their boards in the first place, because Intel already had Thunderbolt 4, which is very similar to USB 4. In fact, they're backwards compatible. So what ended up happening was the option for the motherboard manufacturers was to either buy the Thunderbolt chipset from Intel and offer it on AMD motherboards. But what happened was there was two problems. One, Intel they didn't want to sell Thunderbolt for an AMD motherboard because, I mean, how does that look, right? It's like, hey, you're literally arming your competitor with a feature that you invented. Like, how does that look? You know what I'm saying? So Intel didn't want to do Thunderbolt on AMD. So, but at the end of the day, Intel was like, hey, man, we either, like, don't do it out of spite and lose money, or we just sell the Thunderbolt chips and make money for every AMD motherboard that is sold. We get some money also, even though we're selling a competitor's part. So at the end of the day, Intel was like, okay, yeah, we'll go along with it. And that's why some of the X670E motherboards and B650E, they offer Thunderbolt 4 on the boards. And it's disguised as USB 4. This is the reason why the Crosshair, the X670E Crosshair Extreme, and the Crosshair Hero, meant to go with Zen 4, offers USB 4, because it's actually, and a lot of people don't know this, it's actually full Thunderbolt 4 in disguise as USB 4, which means if you're somebody who has an X670E Extreme, or let's just say a Crosshair, either Extreme or Hero, you actually have Intel's Thunderbolt 4 on your AMD motherboard. Same deal if you have an X670E Taichi from ASRock. You also, or a B650E Taichi, you also have Intel's Thunderbolt 4 on your AMD Ryzen motherboard. Isn't that interesting? So Intel was like, yeah, we'll offer Thunderbolt on the motherboards, or you can buy our Thunderbolt add-in card and you can offer that as an option for AMD. And that's what a lot of people did. Gigabyte in particular, the Aorus X670 or -E or X670E, B650E, you can add a Thunderbolt card optional to a Gigabyte X670 or B650 motherboard, and you can get full USB 4/Thunderbolt 4 support on your AMD motherboard. So I have a video showing how to do this. We covered this way back at the launch of Zen 4 back in 2022. We also did a video on ASRock's Steel Legend with the Thunderbolt add-in card from ASRock. So all of this is like old news at this point. But the question about, like, am I missing out or should I upgrade from the Ace? The answer is probably not, but this is something that you are missing out, because one thing that MSI did avoid, MSI did not buy the Thunderbolt chips from Intel. They basically were like, no thanks, we don't need to offer USB 4, we don't need to offer Thunderbolt, it's not going to be an option. So MSI was the one brand that is completely missing in action when it comes to offering USB 4 on the previous X670 motherboards. So I hope that answers the question. But if it was me, you're probably totally fine just using the Ace all the way until the end of AM5. But Thunderbolt, USB 4, Wi-Fi 7, those are really the only things that you're missing out on. Otherwise, you know. Yes, Nero, you're right. Yes. So, well, we've already been through this whole discussion. I've talked about Thunderbolt on AMD like many, many, many times. I don't want to like take up too much time talking about that unless you people really want me to break down like which motherboards have the Thunderbolt add-in header, which ones don't, which ones include the Thunderbolt. So it's like basically Crosshairs have it, Taichis have it, and then like Strix has the Thunderbolt header. The ProArt, I think, has a Thunderbolt header. Aorus had a Thunderbolt header. And a bunch of ASRock boards like Steel Legend and ProRS all had the Thunderbolt header. So yeah, ProArt actually has full Thunderbolt 4. That's right. It doesn't even have the header. It actually has the Thunderbolt on the board. So yeah. So actually, let me just do that for completion. Let me remove this nitro path stuff. We don't need this anymore. So okay, so Thunderbolt 4 on X670E. So, you have two options. Built-in or optional add-in card. So here are the options. The ones that had it. Crosshair. Tai Chi. ProArt. Those are the only ones that actually had it built in. Which means they had the Intel chip literally soldered on the motherboard. The optional ones are going to be Aorus, Steel Legend, Strix. I think that's it. And I think there was like Phantom Gaming might have had it. Phantom Gaming also possibly. But yeah, Strix has an optional header. So these are the ones that have the header. You have to buy a separate card and plug it in an X4 slot, and then you have Thunderbolt on your AMD board. But anyway, Gigabyte was all add-in card. ASRock was, a bunch of them had add-in cards. Otherwise, Tai Chi had it built in. ASUS is similar to ASRock. The Strix had the add-in. The ProArt and the Crosshair had built in. So this is the reason why people who are on X670E, they don't really care about USB 4, because if they truly want USB 4, they either already have it or they can literally add it to the motherboard if they so choose. It's optional for them. But if you have MSI, if you're someone who has MSI, you do not have any option for Thunderbolt on your X670 motherboard. So that's why I wanted to mention that, because the original question was like, am I missing out on anything, or should I upgrade, or should I stick with the Ace all the way through? Because the Ace is an MSI board, it does not have Thunderbolt 4, it does not have USB 4, and there's no way to add it. So that is one thing that MSI owners are missing out on. If they actually need it, though. I mean, that's the whole point. Like, do you actually need that feature? Okay, so there was a question earlier. I'm going to build all my parts today. 9800X3D 5090 combo. Was going to buy MPG Edge. This issues on Reddit about sleep mode. Please help me choose less glitchy board. I'll tell you which ones I've tested that have the least issues. So for this generation, guys, I can't really comment on X870 Gigabyte, but I have used X670 Gigabyte. And what I can say is, out of the X870, the two that I recommend are going to be ASUS and ASRock. These two seem to have the most solid BIOS currently. As of today, ASUS and ASRock seem to have the most consistent BIOSes. In terms of, like, there's no USB bugs, there's no sleep issue, there's no wake from sleep issue. MSI has had some compatibility issues with third-party add-in cards. Like, for example, AverMedia capture cards are not working properly. I mean, they do work, but sometimes they don't work. And sometimes they blue screen your computer. I mean, that's a huge problem, and that seems to be an MSI problem. So that's why I... Also, like, I guess if you're buying... I don't know. MSI has just been kind of, like, very... not bad, not terrible, but, like, as someone who has been using and testing all the brands, MSI is not my top choice. And I say that as someone who is currently streaming on the Godlike. So, I'm using the Godlike right now, and I'm not actually recommending it. So, personally, I think Asus and ASRock are the best choices this generation, as of right now. Gigabyte, I feel like I'm not being fair to Gigabyte because I haven't tested any of the new Gigabyte boards, but I have used Gigabyte as my primary motherboard all throughout X670E. My previous motherboard was the Gigabyte X670E Aorus Master. So I have the Gigabyte Aorus Master. And that was mostly a good board, but man, the fact that I had to open like 6 or 7 support tickets over the course of 2 years that were all like BIOS related bugs. Nothing wrong with the hardware works, but it's like, man, if you're a power user and you use like a bunch of like stuff like capture cards and add-in cards and 10 gig network interfaces and stuff like that, if you're someone who does that, Gigabyte might not be the best choice. Also, if you're somebody who's doing a bunch of like RAM overclocking, Gigabyte might not be the best choice this generation, although they certainly weren't the best choice the last generation for that. But Gigabyte, if you just play games and you don't mess with your computer, I think Gigabyte is fine. Like, if you're someone who is a power user, though, that's when things start getting a little flaky, and then I'd probably go with ASUS or ASRock. So, those are the two that I have had the most success with those two so far. So, the number one recommendation, people are probably already going to know. Anyone who's seen the tier list video already knows exactly what I'm going to say. The number one recommendation, if you can get one, would be the ASRock Nova. The Nova is currently the best value motherboard. Nothing really comes close to competing with it in terms of the value. So that is if you can get one for the retail price. So the ASRock Phantom Gaming Nova. This motherboard is in a completely special little league of its own. Nothing comes close. Because let's talk about it. Like, do you need 5 M.2s? 5 M.2s. You can do 5 M.2s on the Nova. Do you want a backplate on your motherboard, but you don't feel like spending $700 for a backplate? Well, guess what? For $350, you get a full backplate on the motherboard. The Nova has a backplate. The Nova has the postcode debug. The Nova has the diagnostic audio speaker beep thing, whatever. For the 5 people like me that still use that, it's got it. So 5 M.2s, X1 slot, X2 slot. You want 10 gig LAN? You can add it to the Nova at the bottom PCIe slot for full 10 gig LAN. PCI Gen 5 SSD, PCI Gen 5 GPU, it's got it. 5 gig LAN, it's got it. Wi-Fi 7, USB 4, all those things, RGB header galore, it's got it. So the problem is the Nova literally just has all the things that 95% of all the people who want to build a desktop computer for gaming or whatever, content creation, blah, 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 all that stuff, the Nova does everything. It does every single thing that you can imagine. There are 2 things, maybe 3 things, let's just say there's 2 things that it doesn't do that I can think of that someone might want, but probably most likely doesn't actually need. Number 1, there is no X8 slot, which means you cannot do dual graphics cards. You cannot do SLI, you cannot do NVLink, you cannot do AMD Crossfire. Technically, you can do AMD Crossfire, but no one's going to do that with an X2 slot. So the Nova is not a good choice for multi-GPU. That is one of its weaknesses. It also does not have 10 gig LAN. However, if you want 10 gig LAN, you can add a 10 gig network card to the bottom PCIe slot. We'll probably do a video about this in the near future. So it has the GPU disconnect lever. You don't have to worry about it scratching your GPU, unlike ASUS. So it has the tried and true GPU quick disconnect. It has all the quality of life bells and whistles that you could possibly imagine, and you probably don't even know that you actually need, but you do actually need. So at this point, you're probably realizing, okay, The Nova is the winner because like all the things that I just said. So, yeah. Gigabyte brings the beeps, the Pro. Yeah, but the problem with the Pro is okay. The Pro is nice because it has like a lot of X4 slots. But the problem with the Pro is let's look at it actually. Hold on, what am I doing here? Where's the X870E Aorus Pro? Okay. Let's look at the Pro. Let's compare the Nova to the Pro. So the Pro has the X16 and it has dual X4s. Okay, so here's the thing. The Pro, like the Nova, doesn't have 10 gig LAN, but no one who's paying $300 really cares about that. However, you can add 10 gig LAN to either one of them. So there's that. It's relatively easy to do that. Now, the only problem with the Pro is as soon as you plug something into, okay, 2 of the SSD slots share lanes with the graphics card. So if you're somebody who wants your graphics card to run at 16 lanes while also running all your SSD slots fully populated, you can't do that with the Aorus Pro. The Aorus Pro, you can only use 2 SSDs because as soon as you plug the 3rd or the 4th one in, you drop your GPU to X8 lanes. So just keep that in mind. Now, that's not that big of a deal if you have a Gen 5 graphics card, but that is something to be aware of. A lot of people don't like the idea of installing a 3rd SSD or a 4th SSD. Doesn't matter which slot. It can be either one of them. And then the GPU just immediately like drops down to like half bandwidth. You know, like that is not a feels good. That's like a feels bad, man. Yeah, you're running that GPU at like 8 lanes as soon as you plug that 3rd SSD in. So, and those are your Gen 5 SSDs. So that's the main problem with the Aorus Pro. That's actually the main problem with almost like all the Gigabyte motherboards this generation. Tons and tons of GPU or PCIe lane sharing going on with the Gigabyte lineup this generation. So I don't know how the Pro compares on price, but oh, the other thing too, like I said, on the Aorus Pro, you don't get a backplate. There's no backplate. The Nova, you get a full backplate. $350, full backplate. There you go. You don't have to pay $700 for a backplate. You know what I'm saying? So it's like, man. And guess what? This thing, you can only run 2 SSDs before you drop your GPU to X8. The Nova, you can run 5 SSDs and your GPU is still running at full 16 lanes. So I think we've proven why, like, the Nova seems like it's in a class of its own. So, yeah, 5 gig LAN. I mean, it doesn't have 2.5 gig LAN. It has 5 gig LAN, you know, so it doesn't have 10, but it's like, you really need the 10 when you got the 5? So it's like 5 gig LAN and all that stuff. Man, this thing is kind of like a no-brainer for a lot of people. There's a reason why this thing is sold out all the time. Just saying. Like there's people tend to choose the best value. People tend to prefer the path of least resistance in life. And when something is offering you all this stuff for $350, it's kind of like a, do we really need to think about this? You know what I'm saying? So, wow. $10 gig LAN, it doesn't have 10 gig LAN, but you can add 10 gig LAN to the bottom very easily. You know why? Because it's like it has the 2 lane right there for 10 gig LAN. If you need 10 gig LAN, you can just put 10 gig LAN at the very bottom. So that's pretty amazing. And guess what? The GPU is still full 16 lanes if you add the 10 gig LAN. Wow. Oh man. Yeah, that's no compromise. What's the highest you would pay for the Nova? I would say the value proposition is good all the way up to like 400. Even at 450, so even at the price of the Tai Chi, it's still competitive. I'll be honest, guys, at 450, it's still very, very competitive. Because think about it, 450, even at $450, it's still giving you 5 SSDs, an X2 slot, a quick disconnect, a full backplate. It's still offering the postcode debug, the speaker debug. Like, it's still offering all of those things. So I would say even up to 450, it's good. Now, once you start getting to 500, then I don't think it's the best choice. Because as someone who does a lot of things with a computer, at $500, the Nova makes less sense compared to the other motherboards that are also $500, that are naturally $500. You know, like the Strix-E, because the Strix-E is offering Nitro Path. It's offering the asynchronous E clock. Even the Tai Chi offers asynchronous E clock. The Nova does not have that. So if you're someone who wants to dabble in overclocking, once you get up to like $500, the Nova doesn't seem like it's the best choice at that point. But what's funny, what's hilarious actually, is the fact that even at 450, even at $500, the Nova offers things that those more expensive boards, like the Aorus Master, the Dash E Strix, they don't have. Even the Carbon, the MSI Carbon, none of those boards offer a backplate. They're $500 and they do not include a backplate. Like, that to me is mind-boggling, because it's like the previous Gigabyte, the Gigabyte Aorus Master, had a backplate. So my X670E Aorus Master has a full backplate. The new X870E Master does not have a backplate. So it's almost like Gigabyte is doing a lot of what I consider cost reduction, cost cutting. Like the fact that Gigabyte is doing 6-layer PCB on a lot of their $300 motherboards, like the Pro, or I don't know about the Pro, but yeah, the Pro, the Elite, they're 6-layer PCB boards. The previous generation were 8-layer PCB boards. So Gigabyte to me just seems kind of like, man, I don't know what they're doing. It's like there's a lot of cost cutting going on. So, the X670E Hero does not offer. Yeah, HGZ. Yeah, that is ridiculous. The X670E Hero does not have a backplate. Thankfully, the new X870E Hero that I have does have a backplate. So ASUS did correct that, because that was kind of like, are you serious, ASUS? But yeah, the new Hero does have a backplate. So the X870 Hero, it's funny because it's like, I was talking with one of the guys who's been following the channel for a long time. So I realized something. So I have the X670 Aorus Master and the X870 Crosshair Hero. Both of those motherboards have backplates. But the new Gigabyte, so okay, it's like the old Gigabyte has a backplate and the new ASUS has a backplate. The old Gigabyte, or no, the new Gigabyte does not have a backplate, and the old ASUS did not have a backplate. So it's like ASUS and Gigabyte like flipped their positions. Like on the previous gen, Gigabyte had a backplate, ASUS did not have a backplate. On the new current gen, Gigabyte does not have a backplate, ASUS does have a backplate. So it's like they went in reverse of each other. It's kind of hilarious how that works out. So, I don't know, but like, yeah, 8 layers is standard. Well, not according to Gigabyte. Gigabyte's got 6-layer on most of theirs. Nova or Tai Chi Lite. You know, honestly, I'm not a big fan of the Tai Chi Lite, because I understand what they're trying to do with that board. It's just, I feel like if you're considering a Tai Chi Lite, you might as well spend the $50 and get the Tai Chi. It's almost like it's almost like it's almost like the Tai Chi Lite is kind of there for somebody who is never going to do a GPU upgrade, or they don't care about the new quality of life features that the newer boards offer. So the main thing that you don't get on the Tai Chi Lite, there's no RGB. If you don't care about RGB, then whatever. But it doesn't have the GPU latch. That to me is like, man, that as somebody who benchmarks GPUs and does a lot of GPU swaps, I gotta have the quick disconnect. Especially for people who have a giant Noctua air cooler, for example. The big air cooler gets in the way. It's basically impossible for you to remove the graphics card without... I personally use this thing. This is a rail mount for an old 3.5-inch hard drive. To get my GPU out, I have to like stick this down and press on the clip to get the GPU out. With the new motherboards, I don't have to do that anymore. So yeah, I can't see myself using the Tai Chi Lite because I am not suffering with like having to disconnect the GPU with some like hard drive rail to get it out of there. You know what I'm saying? So it's like I would spend the $50 and get the Tai Chi, like the full blown Tai Chi. You have to use a chopstick. Yeah, like the fact that you have to use some random tool laying around to get that out of there is just ridiculous in 2025. So it's, nah, I gotta have the quick disconnect latch or the lever or the button or something. Like I can't do the old school way of pulling the GPU out anymore. So that's why I don't recommend the Tai Chi for that reason. Or the Tai Chi Lite for that reason, I'll say. So I feel like if you're considering the Tai Chi Lite, just pay the $50 to get the full Tai Chi. You'll thank me later. It's better to have all those quality of life improvements with a new build than to not have them. The other thing too is the Tai Chi has better heat sinks. In particular, the heat sink over on the side next to the RAM is better on the Tai Chi than on the Tai Chi Lite. The Tai Chi Lite still has screws for every heatsink, SSD heatsink, except the one that's Gen 5. Whereas the Tai Chi has quick disconnect for the Gen 4 and Gen 5. So, yeah, I would just get the full Tai Chi at that point. So, yeah, this is okay. Like, if you're someone who's going to build this as like a, I don't know, like a mini workstation and you're never gonna really mess with it, I guess it's fine. But personally, I would just spend $50 more and get the full Tai Chi. The full Tai Chi is a very nice motherboard, so that's still a really, really good motherboard. You can do dual graphics cards. It's an EATX. It has better VRM cooling than the others. It has an SSD that's off here next to the RAM that runs really, really cold. So, yeah, man, the Tai Chi is a very good board. The warranty, I don't know. I don't know anything about that. But so far... Oh, the other thing, too, is if you want to run a lot of memory, like if you want 4 sticks of RAM, ASRock is really, really good at that. Like, I don't know why, but they have found the secret settings or whatever. Like, it's relatively easy to get the 4 sticks of, like, dual rank. So that means, for those wondering, that means 128 gigs of RAM or 192 gigabytes of RAM. You can get that running at pretty high speeds on the Tai Chi fairly easy. Pretty easy. We are going to try testing it on the Nova in the future. So we are going to do 192 gigs of RAM on the Nova because I don't see how it would be any different. It is physically smaller than the Tai Chi, but I don't think that should really be a problem. So but yeah, that's the Tai Chi Lite. I recommend the Tai Chi. So the final answer on that is get the Tai Chi. If you're considering the Tai Chi Lite, just get the Tai Chi. You'll thank me later. Do we want to do another RAM overclocking lecture? I feel like I've done so many of those in so many Tech Thursdays episodes at this point. So, what can we say about the memory? I did put in the title of the stream DDR5 discussion, so I guess we can do that. So we'll just have to here. Let me clear out paint here. Yeah, I probably do need to take some of those old streams and like make a specific video that's an edited version of like all that info combined. But we'll try to do that in this real quick. So the main thing is you have DDR5. So basically for AMD, for Intel, this is not really true, although Intel also does hit diminishing returns on memory overclocks as well. It's just the way Intel's memory controller is designed, it's different, so it scales more linearly. So like if we're comparing like, well, I don't know, if you guys want me to discuss the Intel memory controller, we can do that too. But I guess the main question I think is pertaining to AMD. So with AMD, there's really two memory speeds that matter for most configurations. Unless we're talking 4 sticks of memory, and even in 4 sticks of memory, technically DDR5-6000 is the limit. So there's DDR5-6000 and there's DDR5-8000. These are the only two numbers that actually matter for most setups. There is some argument for like 6400, but it's not guaranteed. So now 8000 is not guaranteed either unless you have a high-end board. So if you want to run 6000, so 6000 is going to be CPU, memory, or let's just say 6000 is CPU dependent. It's CPU dependent. We'll say it's CPU UMC dependent. Unified Memory Controller, also known as the Integrated Memory Controller, or IMC. So DDR5-6000, the CPU matters. So we'll just say CPU matters for DDR5-6000. This means that this is the component that determines the success of the performance of DDR5-6000, if not the memory itself. But we assume that the memory is rated for DDR5-6000 via Expo or XMP, and the cast latency is whatever memory you're buying, so it doesn't really matter. So the other speed is DDR5-8000, and DDR5-8000 is motherboard dependent. We were just talking about motherboards. Oh, how there is justifying these more expensive motherboards. I wonder what justifies more expensive motherboards. Well, DDR5-8000 is another thing that requires a high-end motherboard to run with full reliability and actually working in a stable setup. So it is motherboard dependent. Requires high-end motherboard. So you cannot do DDR5-8000 on a Gigabyte Eagle. It will not work. It will not be stable. So one of them is CPU dependent. This one is CPU dependent. This one is motherboard dependent. Now, which one is better? This one is better. Bigger number, better. It's higher speed. It's more memory bandwidth. It's just straight up better. But 6000 is good for most people because 6000 is typically going to be less expensive, more readily available, and you don't need to spend a lot of money on a motherboard to guarantee 6000 to work. You do need to have I guess we'll say average CPU. If you have a very, very below average CPU with a very poor memory controller, then maybe you can't do 6000 in 1.1, but that's a very, very low percentage of CPUs that are like that. So the advantage of DDR5-6000, so we'll just say the pros of DDR5-6000 are: 1, works on every motherboard. It works on every motherboard. Doesn't matter. You can buy a Gigabyte Eagle and you can run DDR5-6000. You can buy a Prime from ASUS or a ASRock Pro, what is it? Pro RS or whatever. Like the lowest end boards, it'll work. 2, lower cost. So it's cheaper. It's easier to get. It's more affordable. Lower cost and works on every motherboard. The cons, well, the cons are, depending on the CPU, one of the cons is higher idle power. There's that. I mean, it depends on the CPU, though, because if you have a good CPU, you don't need a high VSOC to run DDR5-6000. But there are some corner cases where it could require a higher VSOC, so it could end up with less memory bandwidth, higher idle power, so all those things. So lower cast latency, I don't consider that a pro or a con, because cast latency is RAM kit specific, and you can tune that manually if you want. So we're not going to consider lower cast latency, because you can buy a DDR5-6000 CL30 or a CL28 or a CL26. So that's why cast latency doesn't really factor in. But memory bandwidth does factor in. This is an absolute. This is an absolute, meaning DDR5-8000 will always have more memory bandwidth than DDR5-6000. That is a guaranteed fact. That cannot be disputed, because it's bigger number better. It's that simple. So that's very straightforward. So less memory bandwidth, higher idle power, lower cost, works on every motherboard. So those are we'll do 2 and 2 of each. So DDR5-8000 pros: lower idle power. Oh wow, it's the complete opposite of the DDR5-6000. So lower idle power, less heat. Although it really kind of depends on the memory kit, so I don't know if I want to say less heat, but in general, lower VSOC, definitely a lower VSOC. So that translates into lower idle power, lower temperature, all that stuff. That's one of the main pros. But, okay, we're going to treat those as, like, the same thing. So we'll say more memory bandwidth, just to do 2. So we're going to condense idle power and VSOC into the same thing. And then the cons, expensive, requires a more expensive motherboard, because like I said earlier, this is dependent on the motherboard. The CPU does not matter at all for DDR5-8000 typically, unless you got a horribly binned CPU. But I'll say this: if your CPU is what's limiting you from running DDR5-8000, you're probably not gonna be able to run DDR5-6000 unless you're having to run a much, much higher voltage. So you're going to have like way high idle power if that CPU is just really bad, has a really bad IMC. So that's typically the difference between the two of them. But these are really the only 2 speeds that actually matter. 8000 also doesn't work on dual rank sticks. Yes. At least not yet, but yes. So there are. So I guess the thing is, yeah, currently, yeah, that is worth mentioning. So I guess another con of that would be limited to single rank for now. But that could change in the future. I don't like to put things as absolutes that might not be true in the future. So we'll just leave it like this. Cast latency, anything with cast latency lower rate faster than megahertz. No, memory bandwidth typically wins out over cast latency. And also in terms of like ease of use, memory bandwidth megahertz wins over cast latency. Cast latency does help, but the problem with cast latency is it requires you to do things with voltage oftentimes to get it to work. So typically you have to drive your voltage on the RAM much higher than normal spec. So it's like way out of spec when you're running like really low cast latency, like cast latency 26, for example, on DDR5-8000. So I personally don't think that's really worth it, to be honest. I rather would have higher memory bandwidth. 8000 doesn't really depend on the CPU. No, not really. No. Like I said earlier, if the CPU can't do 8000, then it can't do 6000 with like, really good timings. So, because the IMC will require a higher amount of VSOC. So, typically the speed ratios are the next thing. So, this is known as synchronized. This is synchronized fabric and UMC. So when you run DDR5-8000, you get a latency reduction. You get a natural latency reduction because you have synchronized the fabric. What does that mean? That means if I have data and I'm sending it from the CPU to the memory, it is fully synchronized so that they are in lockstep with each other. So when you have the time-based pulse, like a heartbeat, this is equal to this. They are synchronized. DDR5-8000 is also known as synchronized memory. Synchronization is happening when this is happening. This is not synchronized. This is known as asynchronous. Asynchronous. So you get a latency penalty when you're running it like this. But because you're running the memory controller at a higher speed, it kind of offsets that negative aspect of DDR5-6000. But DDR5-6000 has worse latency between the two if you're talking like making them equal. Now, obviously, you can tune DDR5-6000 to much lower cast latencies so that it can get close to DDR5-8000. In fact, if you have tighter timings on DDR5-6000 versus looser timings DDR5-8000, oftentimes DDR5-6000 can outperform, or at the very least be equal to, DDR5-8000. But you have to remember, when you do that, you're doing something that is unnatural to the state of the clock cycles. So you can tune the cast latency to make up for the lack of being synchronized, but keep in mind that it is still not synchronized. Whereas DDR5-8000 is inherently synchronized, which means that you automatically naturally get lower latency because it hands off. So think of it like if we're handing off the data. So I'm handing it off from the CPU, from the core to the memory. They are in lockstep with each other. They are synchronized with each other like a clock. They are on the same wavelength. They are on the same clock cycle. However, if we are running asynchronized, if we are running DDR5-6000, We are not synchronized. So what happens is you want to send the data, but you're not synchronized. So the hand is here when the hand is trying to go there. So you know what it has to do? It has to buffer the data and then transmit it. So you have buffering of data occurring when you're running it like this because it is not synchronized. So, but because you can tune cast latency to be lower, you can still claw back a lot of the latency penalty by doing that. But this is the reason why DDR5-8000 has a lot of advantages. And this is another reason why what we're starting to see in the mobile space with LPDDR5X, we are seeing LPDDR5X 8000 really starting to take off because people are starting to realize the benefit of running synchronized clock cycles. And this is the reason why you're seeing this happen more and more in the laptop space. So if you look at a lot of the soldered RAM in these SoCs now, you're starting to see LPDDR5 8000 really take off. So DDR5 8000 is definitely the way of the future. It is definitely the future because of the synchronized system. So it's very, very nice. You get a very good, what I call a natural latency reduction because of the synchronized fabric and memory controller. Why are they synchronized? Because if you guys remember, the fabric runs at 2000 megahertz typically. This is the best performance of an F clock. This is like set it and forget it. You don't need to test for stability. It just works. So that is also equal to the memory controller also running at 2 gigahertz when the RAM is running at DDR5 8000. This right here is a mathematical proof. So we can rewrite this as a mathematical proof. FCLK equals UCLK equals 2000 megahertz. It is a mathematical proof. And we have shown this means synchronization is taking place. This means that every nanosecond, every clock cycle, the fabric and the memory controller are in lock sync with each other, so the flow of the data is fully transparent and happens seamlessly on every single clock cycle. It is a mathematical proof. I've proved it right here. It is a very simple proof. F clock equals U clock equals 2 gigahertz. This is full synchronization. So this is the reason why 8000 is really taking off. Now, the challenge with 8000 is going to be that because the memory is running at a whopping 4 gigahertz, MCLK equals 4000 megahertz. This is very fast. The RAM is literally running as fast as CPUs from 5 years ago or 6 years ago. Think about that. The RAM is running at 4 gigahertz. The RAM is running at 4 gigahertz when you're running DDR5 8000. So this is very, very fast. That's very fast RAM, and that results in higher memory bandwidth and ultimately better performance naturally. We're talking about natural performance improvements and natural latency reductions. So this is the reason why we're seeing DDR5 8000 take off in the mobile space, because it's just a no-brainer at this point. So, but because it's running at a high speed, and because we are talking about discrete memory modules that are not soldered to the motherboard, it means that the wire trace runs are very long comparatively to a laptop. So it's much harder to do DDR5-8000 on a desktop versus a laptop because the memory wires are literally longer. So the length of wire from your memory to your CPU, that memory wire, this is the limiting factor in whether or not you can handle DDR5-8000. And this is the reason why I'm saying that it is motherboard dependent, because the quality of those metal wires, those copper wires running from the CPU socket all the way to the memory stick is going to make or break the stability of DDR5-8000. So it is very motherboard dependent. You have to have a high-end, high-quality motherboard to ensure that those wires have the least amount of electrical noise, because when the memory runs very, very fast at a whopping 4 gigahertz, the likelihood of an error occurring goes up dramatically. And that is the reason why I say that it is motherboard dependent. Is it need special cooling for the RAM? No. The only thing that will depend on whether you need cooling for RAM is the voltage on the RAM. The voltage on the RAM determines whether or not you need the cooling, because the voltage on the RAM will ultimately determine how hot the memory runs. What's the capacity limit for 8000? 48 gigabytes. 48 gigabytes on desktop. Laptops, it's currently 64 gigabytes on laptop. Technically, I think it can actually be 96 gigabytes on laptop. But like with Zen, with the, the Ryzen, the Strix Halo, you can do 128 gigs at like 8000. It's crazy. So this is the reason why Strix Halo is insane, guys. Ryzen AI Max Plus does 128 gigabyte at 8000. Think about that. This is the reason why Ryzen AI Max is like in a whole nother planet when it comes to like mobile computing devices. So you currently can't do 128 gigs at 8000 on a desktop platform, but you can do it on mobile. It definitely works on mobile. This is the reason why Strix Halo well, not only is it incredibly impressive in its own right, but dude, like what? Like the 128 at 8 gigabyte at 8000 megatransfers? Yeah, Ryzen AI Max, like I told you guys in some of the previous live streams, mobile is where it's at. This year, the mobile, if you want a new laptop, there are going to be some insanely high-performing laptops that are coming out later this year. So this is just kind of like a teaser trailer of like what you can expect to see in the coming months on laptop platforms and mini PCs, because the Ryzen AI Max is going to offer this on a small mini form factor desktop PC from OEMs like HP real soon, actually. So we may talk about this. I mean, I really want a Ryzen AI Max Plus laptop later this year. I'm hoping that I can get a ThinkPad with one of these. Man, a ThinkPad P1 with Ryzen AI Max Plus, 128 gigs of RAM running at 8000. Dude, like that's like an instant buy. Like that is insane. AI Max handheld? I don't know. That would be interesting, but I feel like handhelds are so power limited. I don't know, man. Like AI Max really shines at like 45 watt. 45 to 60 watt TDP, I think, is where that really, really shines. But the fact that you can crank an AI Max to 120 watt TDP in a full desktop form factor, I think this thing is like crazy good. Because it's not 8 gigahertz. It's 4 gigahertz. It's because this is the transfer rate. So it's you got to remember that DDR5 is double data rate. So DDR5-8000 means 4 gigahertz is the memory speed. So if you're looking for the megahertz, it's 4 gigahertz. It is always half of the DDR5 speed because the DDR5 is double data rate. So it's 4,000 times 2 equals 8,000. So the memory, DDR5-8000 is memory running literally at 4 gigahertz. That is very, very fast, considering that isn't a core. That is literally RAM running that fast. That's very impressive that the RAM is capable of doing that. Okay, so going back to DDR5-6000, I guess, I mean, DDR5-6000 has been good. DDR5-6000 has been out for a long time now. I mean, long time in the PC space. We're talking like since 2022. Technically 2021, I think there were a few 6000 kits, but they were so expensive in 2021 when Intel's 12th gen launched that it wasn't even worth talking about. So, but yeah, DDR5-6000 has been around since the Zen 4 launch. The price has gone down dramatically, so it's definitely price conscious. You can get good capacities. So, like, the main drawback of DDR5-8000 on desktop, like we talked about, it's expensive. It requires a more expensive motherboard. Also, it's limited currently on desktop to 48 gigabyte max is the maximum capacity currently available for DDR5-8000. So you can get 2 single rank 24 gigabyte DIMMs for a total of 48 gigabytes. Now, DDR5-6000, this stuff is available all the way up to, like, you can do 2 times 48. You can do 2 sticks at 96 gigabyte capacity. So you can get like twice the capacity versus DDR5-8000. You can also run 4 sticks of memory, specifically 4 single rank DIMMs for, again, a total of 96 gigabytes. But I think this one typically caps around 96 gigabyte max for 2 sticks. If you want to do 4 sticks, technically you can do 128, 192, but that's where it gets very, very platform specific in terms of whether or not you can actually run that much RAM at 6000. That becomes the really, really hard challenge to pull off for a lot of motherboards. So again, like, if someone is really wanting to do, I guess, for 128 gigabyte and 192 gigabyte at 6000 mega transfers, like, if someone wants to do this, currently I recommend ASRock and Gigabyte. I have had the most success with ASRock and Gigabyte getting these capacities to run at this speed with full stability. The ASUS Crosshair Hero does not do it. I can't get 6000 192 working on a Crosshair Hero. And the Godlike is able to do it, but I mean, are you really gonna buy a Godlike just to do? So you see what I'm saying? So it's like, so really, ASRock and Gigabyte seem to be the better choices for high dense dual rank 4 DIMM setups. So that's from me testing a whole bunch of different motherboards over the years. So that's why I would recommend ASRock and Gigabyte. Tai Chi is really good. The Aorus Master is really good. I haven't tested an Extreme AI Top, so I can't talk about that. I have not. I think I tested the X670 Aorus Elite. That one also worked. And then we're gonna test the Nova soon with this capacity with 192 to see if it works. I think it will work because the Tai Chi worked, although the Tai Chi is a higher end board. But yeah, that is the discussion on RAM. Oh, one thing. Just for completion here. So FCLK equal 2000 megahertz does not equal UCLK equals 3000 megahertz. So this is the reason why this is not synchronized. That is not synchronized. So that is why it's good, it's cheap, you can do a lot of capacity with it, but it's not synchronized, which means you want lower latency. You inherently want lower latency, lower cache latency on your DDR5-6000 versus 8000 because it is not synchronized. So just keep that in mind. Having said all of this, remember that the bottleneck in a memory subsystem is never the memory controller. It is never the fabric. Regardless of what people say, it is not the fabric. It is actually the DRAM chips. The DRAM chips themselves is the actual bottleneck in a memory subsystem. Meaning, the fabric running at 2 gigahertz is not the problem. The memory controller running at 3 gigahertz or 2 gigahertz when synchronized, here it's running slower. But because they're synchronized, you get lower latency. Because here you have buffering happening. Here you have no buffering happening. So sometimes less is more, in this case. But the problem, the bottleneck is never either of these. The bottleneck is always going to be the DRAM itself. The memory chips. The time it takes to complete a read operation or a write operation in RAM is much more clock cycles. It is much more nanoseconds than the time it takes for a memory controller, the UCLK, to process the read request or the write request, or for the fabric to literally just pull the info from the cores or push the info back to the cores from the memory if it's a read. So these two are not the problem. The problem in a memory system, the bottleneck is always going to be the memory. So the faster you can crank your M clock, the faster this goes while trying to maintain latency, the better performance you get. And that is the whole purpose of RAM overclocking. That's why when people are doing extreme overclocks on their Apex or their Tachyon or their OC formula, it's all about cranking the memory controller or the memory speed as high as it can go. As high as it goes, that's what it's all about. That's the name of the game.
Can you explain what is TREFI?
TREFI. So that's a great question. Yeah, we're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about that now, actually. So how can we
have built 2 systems this year, 1W the Nova and 1W the Tai Chi, based on your excellent advice. Thanks for the great content and insights.
Okay, well, I appreciate that. I got a quick question on that. So you have the Nova and you have the Tai Chi. So what are the different, what's the different use cases for you for those 2 computers? Is one of them a gaming computer and the other one is another gaming computer? Or is one of them like a workstation, the other one's a gaming computer? I'm just curious to know, how you're using those 2 computers, those 2 different motherboards, because they're similar, but, one of them has more features for overclocking, the other one is just straight up pure value. Nova for gaming, Tai Chi for productivity. Okay, so yeah, I can see that. It's interesting because I would have actually thought it would be the other way around. So the Nova for productivity, the Tai Chi for gaming, but they can both do the same roles. The Tai Chi, though, just keep in mind, Tai Chi does give you the ability to run a second graphics card in the future. So if you're going to do dual graphics cards, I don't know what the use case is for productivity, but if you're doing dual GPU for AI or rendering or whatever, the Taichi does offer that bottom X8 slot for a second graphics card. That is something that the Nova cannot do. Technically, you can put a second GPU in the Nova, but just know that the Nova, the bottom slot on the Nova is only 2 lanes. So it's PCI Gen 3 versus on the Taichi, it's 8 lanes of PCI Gen 5. So there's a huge difference in terms of the bandwidth that you can drive through that Taichi second slot versus the Nova. And that's the reason why the Taichi is more expensive, guys. The Taichi is capable of doing like more, let's say more niche, like one-off things that most people don't even consider doing. Like dual graphics cards is a good example. You can do dual GPU very easily on the Taichi. You can't do that on the Nova. Not without severe bottleneck penalties on the Nova. Because you're only doing like 2 lanes of Gen 3 on the Nova at best. Whereas Taichi, you're doing full 8 lanes Gen 5. So that would just equal to 16 lanes of Gen 4. So keep that in mind. Meaning, you're not bottlenecking like if you're doing dual, okay, this is going to sound really dumb, but like if you're doing dual 5090s, for example, dual 5090s on the Taichi are not bandwidth limited at all. Whereas if you put a second 5090 in a Nova, that 5090 is severely bottlenecked from a PCI bandwidth. Plus, that slot on the Taichi is further bottlenecked by having to run through both chipsets. Whereas on the Taichi, it is directly wired straight to the CPU, completely bypassing the chipset. So, yeah, those eventually do a second GPU for Taichi. Okay, yeah. Yeah, just make sure that you have a space in the case, because sometimes the that bottom slot is really, really low down. It's like way down on the board. So oftentimes, if you have a triple slot, it's going to overhang, which means you're going to need a full tower, or at least the case needs to have 8 slots on the back to fit that second GPU. Okay, and then the other super chat, can you explain okay, so TREFI. So real quick, TREFI is one of the ways that you can further reduce the latency. In fact, it is probably the best way to reduce the latency without messing with the cast latency and having to crank voltage really high. So TREFI, what it is it is the refresh interval. It is your time refresh interval of the memory. So think of it like the memory holds data every clock cycle, but it has to refresh that data. Otherwise, if it doesn't, due to the variability in the voltage, like things like V-droop and power scaling, the memory can become deteriorated, we'll say. Not necessarily turn into errors. That's if it goes so long without any refresh, it can get corrupted. But because we're talking about volatile RAM, we're talking about volatile memory, which means memory that is not designed to be stored indefinitely for a very long period of time. So when you increase the TREFI, effectively what you're doing is you're increasing the refresh interval for every clock cycle. So how many times it will refresh so that you have fresh memory or fresh data, not memory. The memory doesn't physically change, but the memory, the data in RAM will refresh so that you have it more readily available. And by doing this, by keeping it with a higher refresh interval, so like for example, you can set like default TREFI is like 12,000 something, 15,000 something typically with an Expo profile. If you set it to something like 40K, 35K, the maximum value is like 65,000 something. The higher the number, the lower the latency, because you're making the memory refresh more frequently per clock cycle. So what ends up happening is your latency goes down. The simple reality is the latency goes down because the memory is like basically updating more frequently. However, the drawback is when you make the RAM refresh more frequently, it becomes more temperature dependent. So that is what I'll write on the board. So for people who want to take notes, so REFI. So this is known as the refresh interval for the RAM. This is a memory specific parameter. So higher value equals lower latency. That's typically the relationship between high versus low TRAFI. So the higher your TRAFI, the lower the latency. Typically. Well, actually not typically. That's how it works. However, higher values make the memory more temperature sensitive. Temperature sensitive. So if you crank TREFI really high, like if you max it out or at 40, like I personally use, my personal number for TREFI is 49,920. This is what I use. Feel free to set your TREFI to that if you want. I don't like max TREFI. I do not recommend setting the TREFI to like the maximum number of 65,000. I think it's like 65,355 or 315 or 635 or whatever. It's some 65,000 number. I don't recommend the maximum value because at that value, the memory is very temperature dependent, and if your memory starts running hot, which typically happens when you're playing a game, because when you're playing a game, the graphics card is radiating all this heat into the case, if you have a high-end GPU, for example. So what ends up happening is the heat from the GPU starts heating up the surrounding area because heat travels up. So, and guess what's above the GPU? The RAM is sitting above the GPU, and as a result of this, the memory will start heating up, so your memory can run hotter. And what did we say about TREFI? The higher the TREFI, the more temperature sensitive the memory is. And what that means is that if the memory gets too hot, or if it's running at like 60 Celsius, 65 Celsius, you can start throwing errors in the DDR5 memory. And then that's not going to be good. And that can start corrupting files. That can start blue screening in the worst scenario. It can also cause your game to crash intermittently. And see, a lot of people who mess with this, they don't realize that if their game crashes and they're blaming it on their graphics card having, I often hear driver issues. Oh, it's driver issues. The game is crashing due to driver issues. No, actually, it's not crashing due to driver issues. It might actually be crashing because you're maxing TREFI and your memory is thermal throttling and it's unstable. But a lot of people don't know that. So, I mean, there's a reason why people who run their computer at stock typically never have driver issues versus the people that are complaining about driver issues. Because they're overclocking RAM and they're not realizing that the RAM is actually it's causing instability due to TREFI and the temperature sensitivity. So stuff like this is something to be aware of that's not really talked about. Because oftentimes it's funny because it's like sometimes I'll see like these posts on Steam. Like for example, Monster Hunter Wilds, there's like these posts about Monster Hunter Wilds, like the game crashes. And I'm thinking like, dude, I just did like a 6-hour live stream with the game fully maxed out on a full overclock system, and it's like, I'm not having any problems. Game is running great for me at 4K maxed out, so clearly it's an individual problem. It's not an actual game problem. It's not a it's not a driver problem. You know what I'm saying? So, and I'm running dual graphics cards and mixed vendors and all this stuff. And it's like, it's totally 100% stable for me. So clearly it's not a driver problem. So it's definitely a memory overclock. In fact, the one time that the game actually crashed on stream was because I was overclocking TREFI. So, and forgot to lower the voltage. But sometimes you have to run the higher voltage. So then you have to back the TRA5 value down. You can't run it maxed out. So that is the that is one way to cause your game to crash. Crank TRA5 and then run the RAM at a high temperature. So this is something that no one will ever tell you. No one will ever say stuff like this. That, oh, maybe your game is crashing because your TRA5 is it's maxed out and your RAM is running into thermal issues because your GPU is dumping a lot of waste heat into the computer because it only seems to be unstable when playing that game with an uncapped frame rate. You know what I'm saying? So, but anyway, hopefully that kind of sheds some light on TRA5. So in general, I like to set this to 49, somewhere around like 45 to 50K, somewhere around there. I think that's a good balance. It's not going to be too intense. It's still going to be more temperature sensitive than stock, but it's not going to be as terribly sensitive as like 65K, for example. So that's a good one. Gigabyte recommends this value. I actually got this number from Gigabyte because Gigabyte has a BIOS feature called, I think it's like high memory bandwidth or something. Basically, all they do is they just like set TRA5 to 49,920. And that's the secret setting for the Gigabyte thing in their BIOS. And I've been using this on like a whole bunch of different motherboards, ASRock, ASUS, all of them. It works fine. So, yeah. Just make sure you have good airflow in your case. Also, try to get memory. I can't stress this next point enough. Aim for memory that has a 1.35 volt value on its the VDD. I can't stress this enough. This is the reason why I never have crashing problems, and I'm always 100% stable, like all the time. And you guys who have been following this channel for a while, you know we do like extended play sessions on stream of streaming like these very demanding games like Monster Hunter. Last weekend we were looking at Assassin's Creed Shadows. That's another very demanding game. And we're running full stability and we're running like all these overclocks and stuff, and it's 100% stable, man. Like I'm doing single PC streaming and the whole thing's being stressed out and it works great. But the thing is, RAM at 1.35 is like, that is the GOAT. That is the GOAT, because, or lower if you can, but 1.35 is the magic number. I avoid 1.4 volt and definitely 1.45 volt. The reason why is because guess what? If your memory runs at this high voltage and you try to crank your TRA5 and now you're playing a game and the GPU is dumping all the heat into the system, guess what? 1.4, 1.45, the memory's naturally going to run hotter than memory running at 1.35. So you want to try to minimize the temperature on the memory as much as possible if you are trying to overclock the system and you're also like doing multiple overclocks, like not just the RAM, but you're overclocking the GPU, you're overclocking the CPU, you know, all that stuff. So in general, the lower the voltage, the better, assuming that it is also fully stable. So I do not do 1.4 or 1.45. So I will never buy memory that has 1.4 or 1.45. So I'm running, for reference guys, I run DDR5-8000 at 1.35 volts. These are my numbers. DDR5-8000, 1.35 volts. VSOC is 1.1 volt. These are my voltages. And because these voltages, in fact, I could possibly do 105 on VSOC, but 1.1 volt is set it and forget it. It's 100% stable. It's so good. So this is full stability, and this is probably the best way to keep the memory at a low temperature while also running the VSOC at a low voltage, so I have very low idle power and very low idle temperatures. So I've seen comments on some of the videos like, how are you running? It's like someone was saying like, how is your CPU idle temp so low? And they're like, you're on an air cooler, and I'm on like this other person was like, they're on a 360 AIO, and they're idling at like, I don't know, like 48, 51, and I'm idling at like 39 or 41 or something. And it's like, well, dude, the answer, VSOC. That's the answer. Low VSOC. So, yeah, that is the way. No, VSOC should not go above 1.2 volts. No, you can do 1.3. 1.3 is the absolute max. There is no reason to do 1.3 volts VSOC ever. In fact, that's responsible for the exploding CPUs.
Congrats on 100 Tech Thursdays, +3. Thanks for the best tech streams.
Hey, thanks, Toasty. Yeah, I can't believe we're actually at episode 103. We've done 103 episodes. Wow. But yeah, VSOC, you want low VSOC, you want low VDDQ, you want low VDD. Basically, the lowest voltages is the best. Capacity 48 gigabytes. For that setup, it's 48 gigabytes. We already mentioned that. DDR5-8000 today maxes at 48 gigabytes. So this is perfect for a 9800X3D, actually. This is not ideal for a Ryzen 9 because your core to memory ratio is not ideal. You're basically undersized on the memory for how many cores you have, but you can still do it. It's just you're undersized. But this is perfect for like a 9800X3D. Also, the other thing too is people are like, well, if you have X3D, the memory doesn't matter. Actually, that's not true at all, because there are games. Monster Hunter Wilds is the prime example of a game that literally scales with memory bandwidth. Like Monster Hunter Wilds, the faster your memory, it doesn't matter if you're on X3D or non-X3D. The faster your memory, the better your average FPS in Monster Hunter Wilds. Because Monster Hunter Wilds is so CPU demanding that even with X3D, we are seeing insane memory scaling with Monster Hunter Wilds. So there are those certain games that have a use case for memory bandwidth. The RE engine, using an open world design, really benefits from memory bandwidth. So the higher speed your memory, and that is the reason why I think a lot of people that are having performance issues with Monster Hunter, most of them are playing the game on DDR4 based systems from like 4 years ago, and that's the reason why they're having issues, because the memory bandwidth from DDR5 is significantly better than DDR4. So Monster Hunter Wilds, as hard as that game is to run, it is a very good example of how software can be a product of the technology at the time that it exists. So what I mean by that is we live in a world now where DDR5 is kind of the standard for today, not DDR4. DDR4 is slowly being phased out. But we live in a DDR5 world, and games that are coming out now are going to probably benefit more from memory bandwidth going forward. Monster Hunter Wilds is a very good case study on a modern game that's using not necessarily a modern engine, because RE Engine's been around for many years now, but it shows that the game engine has challenges scaling with NPCs and draw distance and levels, or like level of detail, and ambient occlusion, things like that. So, and all the AI stuff that's running in memory, running in the CPU, that just makes it even more CPU bound. So the more memory bandwidth you have, the better that game benefits from it versus other games that don't benefit so much from memory bandwidth. So, very interesting game. Probably my favorite game of the year so far. You've only seen one proven example that 48 was a little faster than 32. It's not about 48 versus 32. It's about the fact that if you want the highest capacity available today for DDR5-8000, 48 gigabytes is the way to go. Maybe there was some other comment earlier that that's, I don't know, maybe there was some sidebar discussion there. I guess there was some other discussion. I don't know what that was. Inzoi is coming out today, I think. Is anyone going to be playing that? I saw a thing about that earlier. Inzoi is available now. It's available early access on Steam right now. $40, Inzoi. Is that game hard to run? The game... Hold on. Have we talked about Inzoi? Hold on. What did we cover? All the things we talked about? Motherboards we talked about. Okay. I guess this will be the upcoming games section. So this will be the last topic of the stream. Inzoi. Okay. Inzoi. Hold on. How do I find the, Okay, let's just go to the Steam page. Whoop. Okay, there we go. Oh, you guys can't see it. Okay, here we go. So, Inzoi. Inzoi looks like it is a competitor to the Sims series. So, it says here... Minimum spec is always a joke. Like, I feel like minimum spec is a straight up lie from developers in 2025. Like, so far, the games that have come out this year, the minimum spec is not good enough for the game. So I always go by recommended as kind of like the starting point. So recommended specs, well, let's look at minimum. So minimum, you need an Intel i5-10400 or a Ryzen 5 3600. Basically, I feel like every developer nowadays just copy-paste these two CPUs. They just plaster them on their game. It's like they don't think of the minimum spec. So it's like, I swear, it feels to me like I've looked at so many of the system requirements for all these games that are coming out this year, and every single one of them, it's always like they copy each other. It's like the developer was like, oh, I forgot to put minimum specs. They look on Steam at like other games and they see, oh, the i5-10400 and the Ryzen 5. They just copy paste that from another game and they just put it right there on their game. I feel like they're just copy pasting this from like someone else's game at this point. So apparently, a Comet Lake. What is this? This is I gotta think about this. This is 14 nanometer plus. This is 5 pluses. 14 nanometer plus, or a Ryzen 5 3600, which is a CPU that came out on July 7th of 2019. 2019. The Ryzen 5 3600 is a CPU from 2019. Wow. So it's like they literally just like looked at someone else's game page and they're like, yeah, let's just go with that. Just put that in there. And then you need 12 gigs of system RAM. Who runs 12 gigs of system RAM? Like, why isn't it 16? Like, how does this even work? So literally to run minimum spec, someone needs to buy a 4 gigabyte DDR4 stick and an 8 gigabyte DDR4 stick. So you have mismatched memory kits and you stick the two of them in the computer. So you have 4 plus 8 gigs of RAM, which is terrible. That's like totally not recommended. So whoever wrote this, I don't think this is straight up a lie. Like this is basically a blatant lie. The memory being 12 gigs is literally a lie. Like, no one has a computer. No one is going to be gaming on a 12 gigabyte RAM PC. Like, no one is going to do that. Maybe if you have a laptop, and that assumes that you have probably, like, 4 gigabytes of soldered memory and then like 8 or maybe 8 gigabytes of soldered RAM, and like you put a 4 gigabyte SODIMM in there for whatever. Like, I don't know who's doing that, but that sounds terrible. And then the RTX 2060 as a GPU from 2018, and the AMD 5600 XT is a GPU from 2019. So again, these like this is like a pre-pandemic PC, although the i5 is technically from 2020, so that is literally the definition of the pandemic CPU. But yeah, this other stuff is like really old. DX12. Oh, look, DX12 is required. DX12 is required. You cannot run DX11. You have to have DX12. 40 gigabyte. I'm surprised that it needs 40 gigabytes. Considering the type of game this is, I'm surprised this is a 40 gigabyte game. But what's even more surprising is the fact that recommended magically needs 60 gigabytes of storage. Since when does the storage requirements actually change between system requirements like that? That further proves that this is a blatant lie, that someone literally like copy pasted this from some other game and just stuck that there as minimum. So I don't believe the minimum for a second. Recommended is actually the minimum. So considering the type of game this is, like, this is, you can tell, like, okay, yeah, this is a CPU bound game. It's pretty obvious, but it's also going to be very GPU bound considering the sort of visual qualities that it allows for. So first of all, this game is going to need a super high-end CPU. Now, they're saying recommended is going to be Intel's 2021 or late 2021 Alder Lake i7 12700K. This is 8 P cores plus 4 E cores for a total of 20 threads for the CPU. And then a surprisingly AMD 7. Now, this did change. I don't know when they changed this, but originally, in fact, they may have changed this literally today, because I looked at this before the stream earlier today, and it said Ryzen, it said 5800X. In fact, you can go online and find the requirements listed on other websites, and they literally say Ryzen 7 5800X. So I don't know, like, when they made this change, but that is quite a massive change from a 5800X to a 7800X 3D. So anyway, 16 gigs of RAM. That is straight up minimum. I would not recommend this for, like, this is minimum spec. This is not recommended spec. RTX 3070, 8 gig, AMD 6800. The GPUs don't even match up because this is like a full, like, 2 levels underneath this one. And then this is like half the VRAM of this one. So I don't know what they're doing here, but okay. We'll see how this runs on a 3070 with only 8 gigs of VRAM with a game that looks like this. Okay. And again, DX12. And somehow it's 60 gigabytes for recommended, but only 40 gigabytes for minimum. I don't know how that works. I have no idea how that works. Like, how does minimum have only like 20 gigs less of storage required? Like, what? I don't know. Is anyone here going to play this game? Who's been playing Inzoi? You're going to try it? Wizard says no. No, so I guess, okay. Everyone else is like no comment. HTZ, nah. Okay. Yeah, this game is DX12. I have no idea what engine this is using. Does anybody know? This looks like some kind of proprietary engine. Like, it looks really good. Like, the in-game graphics look really good. So I just don't know, like, how is this going to run, man? Like, this looks like this is going to be really hard to run. It looks like it's going to require, at the very least, this game is going to require a monster CPU. Because look at all the NPCs. and the draw distance and the level of detail distance and NPC density, like, this is a game that can probably look really bad on low spec hardware with like textures not loading in correctly and out of memory issues, and you know the classic like polygon triangles walking around in the game because the VRAM is overloaded or whatever. Like, I can see a bunch of that showing up on in screenshots. Yeah, it looks like a next gen version of The Sims. Like, it looks like a much better version of The Sims. This game gives you Sky City unoptimized algorithm flashback. I don't know. Like, it looks like it's gonna be good, but I have no idea how it's gonna run. That is the big game coming out this week, though. The other big game that's coming out this week is the first Berserker Kazan. So that's like a Souls-like game, but it's actually more like Neo than it is like any of the Dark Souls games. The only thing that it seems familiar with, like Dark Souls, is the bonfire system and the hub system. But it's mission-based like Neo. It is loot-based like Neo. And it's kind of story-driven like Neo as well. Spawnbleed just subscribed. Welcome to the stream. Welcome to the channel. Thanks for subscribing. Matisse and into Q1 become a self-maintaining segment. So what? Okay. Okay. You're talking about new product? Isn't Matisse like end of life? Like, I don't think AMD's manufacturing Matisse anymore. I would be very surprised if there's still like Zen 2 being manufactured. So that should definitely be end of life. In fact, Vermeer should be end of life. Although I don't know if Vermeer is end of life, because I think it should be end of life because DDR5 is much lower price-wise as it was even last year. So I don't really see a reason for AMD to keep manufacturing or keep orders for Vermeer. You're talking about used... Oh, you're talking about used PC. Oh, yeah. Well, yeah, okay. Yeah, I think Vermeer is end of life. I would be very surprised if Vermeer is still, like, newly manufactured. But what's crazy is Vermeer is still readily available at, like, Micro Center. Like, it's pretty easy to buy. If you want, like, a Zen 3 DDR4 computer in 2025, like, brand new, technically you can still get one. The motherboards are starting to become harder to get, though. So I feel like they're slowly being phased out. I mean, I think Intel timed the market. So Intel kind of... It's weird because Intel launched DDR5. They went to market with DDR5 first with Alder Lake, but the problem was DDR5 was so cost prohibitive back then. Everybody who bought Alder Lake is basically on DDR4. Anyone who got it when it was new, I should say. The first year, or even the first 2 years. In fact, a lot of people who got like Raptor Lake still end up with DDR4. So the following year. So Intel, to their credit, Intel was right when a lot of the industry analysts were criticizing them. I still remember this. I'm not going to name any names, but there were some industry analysts out there who were saying, I remember this because they said this in 2021 when Alder Lake launched. They criticized Intel for making 12th gen Intel or 12th gen Alder Lake be backwards compatible with DDR4. Because they were like, nah, Intel should have just gone all in on DDR5. And I thought that statement was the dumbest statement I ever heard, because I was like, these people are either given the hardware for review for free, so not having to think about how much it costs someone to buy DDR5. But as someone who bought a 12th gen Intel on launch day, and I was there on the battlefield at the Micro Center to get the 12700K, on launch day, and I saw the price of DDR5 back in 2021, and I'm like, nope, I'm not doing that. We are totally going to reuse DDR4 with the 12700K. So I bought a Z690 Gaming X DDR4 at Micro Center. This is the board. Here it is. I still have it. In fact, we're probably going to do a Monster Hunter stream on this board real soon, guys, to showcase DDR4 on Monster Hunter Wild. So, Z690 Gaming X DDR4 with a 12700K. And the fact that Intel went with compatibility, they had a memory controller for DDR4 and DDR5. That was the smartest decision. That was the best decision they made, because the alternative was to pair it up with super expensive DDR5. We're talking $800 for 64 gigs of DDR5 5600 with no RGB. That's how much that RAM would have cost if I was going to buy it on launch day. And I was not about to pay $799 for 232 gig sticks that runs at DDR5 5600 CL30. I wasn't about to do that in November of 2021. That's when this was new. So Intel was the first to offer DDR5. No one bought the DDR5 though, but they also were the first to bring PCI Gen 5. Remember, AMD was first to market with PCI Gen 4. In fact, AMD was literally like the only option for Gen 4 SSDs and Gen 4 GPUs for like 2 years. It took Intel, AMD did Gen 4 in 2019 with X570 and Zen 2. Matisse supports Gen 4. That's Ryzen 3000 supports PCI Gen 4. Intel didn't support PCI Gen 4 until Rocket Lake 11th gen, which was Z590 in 2021. That is literally 2 years after AMD came to market with PCI Gen 4. But remember, so it's funny because it's like this is how you can tell who's a true tech enthusiast, because the people who remember these transitions are what I consider true tech enthusiasts. Like the fact that if you bought an AMD motherboard, so we don't need this one anymore. So let's do X570 Crosshair Hero 8. Yeah, this one. Well, it's actually the Wi-Fi one, but whatever. Anyway, so this motherboard here, this is the motherboard that I had for the Matisse launch. Back in 2019, my ROG Crosshair Hero 8 or Crosshair 8 Hero Wi-Fi. So mine's the Wi-Fi one. But anyway, the point is, this had Gen 4. But because the early adopter boards had Gen 4, the chipset ran hot. So that is the reason why these motherboards had fans on them. You can literally see, like maybe we can get a better picture here. If we go to the gallery, there is a chipset fan on this X570 motherboard. I don't understand, like, why is it going so slow? Okay, ASUS, I guess they're cached this website because no one goes to this old motherboard anymore. I don't know what the deal is here. But anyway, they had fans on the chipset back in the 2019 motherboards because these are the first ones with Gen 4. And back then, Gen 4 required higher wattage on the chipset. I think they were running at like 15 watts. So they needed, or it's like 12 watts, I think, 12, 15 watts. So they definitely needed active cooling on the VRM for the first generation of PCI Gen 4. So AMD had PCI Gen 4 all the way back in 2019. But Intel was the first with PCI Gen 5 on the graphics card slot. So Intel was so ahead of the game when it came to Gen 5 and DDR5, they launched DDR5 capable CPUs when no one would buy a DDR5. And they also launched PCI Gen 5 motherboards like this Z690 when we're talking 2021, and only now are we getting Gen 5 GPUs in 2025. So like that's how future proof this platform was from a PCIe slash DDR. Well, DDR4 is like, but I'm just saying, like, I remember the transition from PCI Gen 3 to PCI Gen 4. The transition to PCI Gen 4 required motherboards that needed fans on the motherboards. And then the transition to Gen 5 was such that I don't know what's up with ASUS's site here, but the transition to Gen 5, like, there was no Gen 5 GPUs for literally years, and DDR5 was so stupid expensive that no one bought it. So that first whole 2 years or whatever. So I think AMD really had that technology advantage from like 2019 through 2022, and then Intel was kind of a little bit too early, I'll say. Like Gen 5 was definitely not a selling point in 2021 for sure. DDR5 was also not really a selling point in 2021. In fact, in 2022 it was not a really good selling point either. Like even when Zen 4 came out in 2022 with 13th gen Intel, they were like, AMD was DDR5 only and Intel was backwards compatible with DDR4. And as a result, I think Intel outsold AMD when it came to Raptor Lake versus Zen 4 because AMD was DDR5 exclusive, and a lot of people still ended up buying like DDR4 for Intel. Okay. 8,000, what are we talking about? Am I getting the Apex? No. Probably not, no. I mean, I definitely don't need another motherboard. If you don't care about RGB and don't want... What are we talking about? Oh, you guys talking about Apex? The Apex is meant for overclockers, guys. Like, this is definitely an overclocker's motherboard. What are we talking about with the, like, there's some kind of, I'm trying to understand the sidebar conversation with all, there's like a lot of like comments related to RAM, but I don't know in what context any of that is. Will you buy a 4K 27-inch OLED? Probably not, because I'm happy with my 32-inch 4K OLED, and I'm still happy with my 27-inch 4K IPS. Like, my IPS is still good. So I don't know. Like, I'm currently reading the chat off of a 27-inch 4K IPS. This is my very first 4K monitor. So we do Tech Thursdays without an OLED screen. Like, this is literally just an IPS monitor. He asked what RAM kit to get. Check the description of the video if you want to get some recommendations for memory. It's literally in the video description of the stream. I have options in there for 48 gigabytes. I have options for 96 gigabytes. The DDR5-8000 kit is a 48 gigabyte kit. Then we have some options for 96 gigabytes. I think those are like 6,400. The total memory is more dependent on like use case. It has nothing to do with gaming. I'll tell you that. The memory has nothing to do with gaming. Like, it's about, like, in terms of the capacity. Like, we're not talking about gaming. We're talking about, like, why do you want 96 gigs? Why do you want 48 gigs? So it's like, it's dependent on how you use the computer. Like, that's not necessarily dependent on gaming. Gen 5 versus Gen 4 SSD, is there a noticeable difference in game? No, unless the game uses direct storage. And even then, it has to be using direct storage 1.0. Direct storage 2.0, you won't really notice much of a difference because the CPU or because the GPU is offloading a lot of the scheduled decompression work. All I can say, Cats, is wait. No, Cats was saying something else. Oh, all I can say is we have done comparisons, and your friend is not wrong, but it depends on the game. I did a video years ago. Well, years ago. It was like, when was this video? I think it was like in early 2023 when the very first Gen 5 SSD came out. The thumbnail of the video has a picture of Vegeta crushing his scouter, saying it's over 9,000. If you want to find that video on the channel. So just look up like my video that I did for PCI Gen 5. So I think it was January 2023 or maybe it was February 2023. I did a video comparing PCI Gen 3 versus I think it was SATA versus Gen 3 versus Gen 5. I did not have a Gen 4 SSD for that video, but I did Gen 3 versus Gen 5, and I think SATA also. And literally Gen 5 had the highest average FPS. But the reason why is because we were benchmarking a game that uses direct storage 1.0, which is similar to Monster Hunter Wilds. So Monster Hunter Wilds has higher FPS with a faster SSD. Because of the constant streaming of the texture data coming in from the CPU, from the memory, from the SSD to the memory, to the VRAM, I should say, the CPU is handling that, not the GPU. So because of that, the game is constantly CPU bottlenecked, and it is constantly memory bandwidth bound. So the faster your memory, the better your FPS in Monster Hunter. The faster your SSD, the better your FPS in Monster Hunter. Because the faster you can pull the data from the SSD, the better your frame rate with direct storage-based games that are using the CPU to handle the to handle the decompression of the textures. The texture data in the game. So yeah, it does make a difference, but it's very application specific to actually see the difference. Any recommendation for 64 gigabytes of RAM? The reason why I don't... Okay, very simple answer, guys. For DDR5... For why I don't recommend 64 gigabytes. There's nothing wrong with 64 gigabytes. Here, do I want to delete all this stuff? I guess get rid of some of this. Get rid of the memory picture or whatever. Okay. Well, do we want to get rid of all of this? I don't know. Maybe not. Hold on. Okay, there we go. So I left this stuff, but I deleted a bunch of other stuff. Okay, so the reason why I don't like, it's not that I don't like 64 gigabytes. The reason why I recommend different capacities other than 64 is as follows. Because DDR5-8000 implies 2x 24 gigabytes. Now, technically, you can do or 2x 16, but my reasoning is, why settle for 2 times 16 when 2 times 24 is not that much more expensive, considering the speed of the memory? So that's the reason why I don't recommend 32 for that reason, because 48 gigabytes is currently the highest capacity 1 DPC single rank configuration This is why I like 48 gigabytes of RAM. Because if you want to run DDR5-8000 for all the reasons we talked about earlier in the stream, provided you hit the checklist of you have a good motherboard, all this stuff, like there's basically a bunch of requirements to be able to do DDR5-8000. So a lot of people don't like it for that reason. But if you're someone who can do all of that, can get all the checklists completed, like, okay, you have a high-end board, all this stuff, this will give you the best overall experience playing games, as well as the system being very good. So overall, like in just general use. That's why I like 48 gigabytes, because 48 gigabytes is the highest capacity for DDR5-8000 on a 1D PC, which means 2 sticks of memory, and it is single rank DIMMs. Single rank DIMMs. Okay. Now, if you want more than 48 gigabytes, DDR5, that's where DDR5-6000 comes in. DDR5-6000 implies, at least as far as I'm concerned, that you're running either 2 times 32 gigabytes or 2 times 48 gigabytes. Or you're running 4 times 16 gigabytes or 4 times 24 gigabytes. All of these amounts can easily run DDR5-6000 in a 1-to-1 ratio with no problem. All of these. So notice what this is. So now let's reveal them. This is 64 gigabytes. This is 96 gigabytes. This is 64 gigabytes. This is 96 gigabytes. So notice something here. Notice this. You can do 2 sticks, 64, or you can do 2 sticks, 96, or if you want, you can do 4 sticks, 64, or you can do 4 sticks, 96. So the only reason why I recommend 96 is because it's the higher number. In both scenarios, whether we're talking 2 sticks of dual rank, dual, single, or single. Man, we got to keep moving this around. Maybe I should have cleared the entire board. So you can either run 2 dual rank, or 2 dual rank with a higher capacity, or you can run single rank, 4 sticks single rank, or 4 sticks single rank. So the reason why I recommend 96 gigabytes is the same reason I recommend 48 gigabytes. Because 48 is better than 32 for DDR5-8000. It is more future-proofed. It is more memory. Therefore, it is more better. It is just more better in the long run. That sounds so stupid to say, but it is more better. Literally, 48 gigabytes versus 32 gigabytes. 48 gigabytes wins from a practical, future-proof standpoint. Likewise, 96 gigabytes is better than 64 gigabytes because of the sheer fact that it is literally more memory at the exact same speed, and the cost ratio of DDR5-6000 for these amounts, 64 versus 96, is really not that much more when you think about it. So these are the setups. This works fine. This works fine. This works fine. And this works fine. In fact, this is what I am currently running. We are literally doing this one right now. This computer that we are running on stream literally right now is 4 times 24 gigabytes. 4 times 24 gigabytes. Where is it? Wake up all my drives. Here we go. Task Manager. There we go. Right there. 4. I guess that's visible. Yeah, that should be visible. Right there. 6,400 mega transfers, 96 gigabytes of memory, 4 of 4 DIMM. We are running 4 24 gigabyte DIMMs with a AMD Ryzen 9 9950X with full 100% stability. This computer has been running like this. Well, literally, we've been using the memory like this since the livestream PC build way back in November. The computer works like a champ. I put it to sleep, wakes up out of sleep, everything works good. So this is totally doable. So if you want 4 sticks of memory because you like the look of 4 sticks of RAM versus 2 sticks of RAM, this is the way to go. This gives you 96 gigs, 4 sticks. You can do 6,000 if you want. You can do 6,400. I'm doing 6,400 here. And there you go. There you go. Full stability. 4 sticks. Works good. Works good. So that is what I recommend. Now, if you want to do 2 sticks, you can do 2 sticks. That's totally fine. It's basically the same result. It's basically this. I was running this previously for like 2 years, and then we switched over to the 4 sticks because I like the look of the 4 sticks better. But either way, I'm saying like you're pretty much capped at 96. So look at it this way. Look at it this way. You want single rank? You want high speed? 48 gigabytes is where it's at. You want capacity? You want 4 sticks because you like how it looks for aesthetic reasons? 96 gigabytes is the way to go. Why? Because it's better than 64 and more, it's bigger number better. 4 sticks looks better than 2. Now, you can still do 64 gigs with 4 sticks, but to me, I don't know, man. That doesn't feel... Like, 4 sticks, 64 total, that feels so DDR4 to me. My DDR4 computer was 4 sticks of DDR4 3200 on a Ryzen 5800X. You know, with that motherboard that we were talking about earlier, the Crosshair 8 Hero, I was running 4 sticks, 4 times 16. I was doing 4 times 16, which was actually dual rank on DDR4. Until way later on, after I had moved to DDR5, they came out with single rank with that capacity. Those of you who keep saying that 32 is enough, you need to tune into the weekend live streams when we're live streaming games on the PC. And I have Task Manager up, and that shows how much system RAM is being used. I have been pulling more than like 36 gigs of system RAM while streaming. So 32 gigs is totally not enough. Like in 2025, especially for a power user or video editing, 32 ain't cutting it, man. 48 is like barely like holding the line as far as I'm concerned. So I'm desperately wanting to see higher capacity single rank DDR5 because I want to see like DDR5-8000 in like, you know, 64 gig capacity single rank or something. So casuals can get but see, my point of view on that is like casuals can get away with 32. Why not casuals just settle for 48? Why settle for 32 when you can get 48 and it isn't even that much more money? See, I don't get it. Like, to me, personally, if I was going to build just a gaming computer, no streaming, no editing, nothing, no. 48 gigs is what I would go with. 48 gigs is what I would go with. Not 64, not 32. I think these other ratios, these other capacities, 48 gig, 96 gig, those are way better than like 32 and 64. 32 and 64 feels so DDR4, man. That just feels like DDR4. Like 48 and 96 is where it's at for DDR5 in 2025. So if you want a blazing fast gaming PC, 9800X3D, pair that up with DDR5 and a high-end board, DDR5-8000 48 gigs is where it's at. That's where it's at. I mean, I'm telling you guys from personal experience because we've been streaming on these systems. I've been doing video editing on these systems. I know exactly how much memory I can pull from a system when streaming. Now, when just gaming, 48 gigs is good. 48 gigs is way better than 32. 32 is like so 2019, man. In fact, oh man, do I need to list my memory capacity history? Like 32 gigs feels like 2017 to me, like for real. Like I'll tell you guys, my computer in 2012, I was 16 gigabyte DDR3. 16 gigabyte DDR3. So I was doing was it 2? No, it was 4 times 8. No, that's not right. 4 times 4? 4 times 4. Wow. 4 times 4 for 16 gigabyte DDR3. This is my memory. Well, I was doing like 2 times 8 on another computer. So this is basically my, no, well, actually this is 20. We'll say 2013. 2013. So 2013, that was my memory capacity. So I was doing 16 gigs in 2013. So fast forward to 2017 with the release of the Ryzen 7 1800X. Guess what? Ryzen 7 1800X, we were doing 4 times 8, 32 gigabyte DDR4. This is 3200. This was 1600. So for people that are wondering. So this is like, I'm just going off of the history, man. Like this is true tech enthusiast stuff right here. 32 gigs in 2017. In 2017, we were at 32 gigs in 2017. Then in 2019, 2 or 3 years later, somewhere around there, I went to 4 times 16. So I doubled up to 64 gig, DDR4, 3200 MTS, somewhere in there. Maybe it was 2020. I kind of forget if it was the pandemic or not the pandemic. Anyway, I have been using 64 gigs since like 2019 with like X570. So to me, like when people are like, oh, 32 gigs is enough, I'm like, man, I don't know what you do with your computer, but like 32 gigs is not enough. Like I'm just thinking of my, like how I have progressed in terms of memory utilization over the years. And then 2022, what did we do in 2020? No, 2023. 2023? Yeah, 2023 was when I made the jump. It was 2023 when I went to 2 times 48. That's a massive jump. Although I will say, 2022, I did go with 2 times 32. So that's 64 on DDR5. 5600 mega transfers. So this is basically like that's still 64. So I made the jump to 96 gigs in 2023. 2 times 48 gig was 96 gig DDR5, 6400 mega transfers in 2023. Okay, that still fits. So, you know, I was doing 4 sticks. Then DDR5 came out. I'm like, oh, 2 sticks of DDR5 is equal to 4 sticks of DDR4. So that's when I started doing like the 2 sticks of memory. And I'm like, oh, I can't settle for this 2 sticks of RAM. This looks too ugly. I want that 4 sticks. I need my 4 sticks. I need to go back. I need to go back. So that's when we started experimenting last year with the 4 times 24 for 96 gigabyte DDR5 6400 mega transfers, and which is currently what I'm running. So that is kind of like the breakdown of like how memory scaling has gone for me at least. So currently we are streaming with 96 gigs. We just showed the task manager, 4 sticks of memory, but it's kind of capped at 96, guys. Like the only systems that are doing more than that are systems that are running like really slow memory, or you're literally on Threadripper with like 128 or 256 or 512 or some ridiculous amount. Yeah, I really want to see 32 gigs. So Wizard makes a good point. Wait for 32 gig single channel. I really, really want 32 gig single channel. Let's put it this way. The moment like 32 gig single channel or single rank, not single channel, 32 gig single rank, which means 64 gig, 2 times 32 for single rank. That means you can do DDR5-8000 with 64 gigs. That I will recommend. That I will start recommending. But until that happens, no. We're just going to go with better value. Right now, 48 gigs is the king of value for single rank, 2 sticks, and 96 is the king of value if you're doing like 2 times 48, or if you want good looking builds with 4 sticks, 96 is still the king. So it's like, that's the reason why we don't recommend 64, because 96 is better than 64. So let's put it this way. If somebody does this, pretty much like I can sit on this amount of RAM all the way until AM5 is retired. Meaning I don't have to upgrade my memory anymore. Like literally I can sit on 96 gigs all the way until the very last AM5 CPU. I can literally just buy that, whatever the last CPU is, stick that in, replace my 9950X with whatever that is, and don't have to do anything to the RAM. The RAM will just sit there, 96 gigs, don't have to worry, future-proof. So, okay. There's 32 single rank, and I'll buy you. Yeah, if you can do 64 gigs total on single rank kit, that's good. But those don't exist yet. So Yorkfield, man, that's what? Yeah, you basically sit 96 gigs, man. 96 gigs is where it's at, because you can literally sit on 96 gigs until the end of DDR5, until DDR6. Yeah, this is the value, guys. Like, this is the value. Basically, as someone who has built a whole bunch of computers in the last 2 years and played around with DDR5, I have tested DDR5 4 sticks, DDR5 2 sticks, dual rank, single rank, all the different variables. In fact, we're going to look at 192 gigabytes real soon on the ASRock Nova, so stay tuned for that. But as someone who has tested all these different capacities and all this stuff, and I've done 128, 64, 32, all that stuff. I've done all of that. And what I can tell you is my experience has come to the conclusion that there's only really 2 optimal choices. You're either doing this, which we've already talked about why that's good. Basically, the whole first half of the stream has talked about that. Or you're doing one of these 4. You're doing one of these 4. For like future-proof reasons or whatever the reason. And why settle for 64 when you can get 96 in either 2 or 4 stick capacities. You see what I'm saying? So I've come to the conclusion that, and knowing what I know about editing videos and like streaming and like how much memory is actually used, 48 gigs is fine. 48 gigs is fine for literally everybody. But if you need more RAM, for whatever reason, if you need more than 48 gigs for whatever reason, why settle for 64 when you can settle for 96 and you get the choice of either 2 sticks for practicality or 4 sticks for the looks, for the aesthetics of the build, because 4 sticks subjectively looks better than 2 sticks of memory. So why settle for 64 when you can settle for 96 and literally sit on 96 gigs until like DDR6? See, that is the conclusion that I've come to as someone who has tested, like, literally, guys. We literally have like a whole stack of memory like ready to go to test. So I'm not just making this up. Like, we've done a lot of tests. We're gonna be doing a test with the Nova real soon. So it's literally, there's 2 choices. There's 2 choices: 48 gigs or 96 gigs. Take your choice. And if you're going 96, you can choose between 2 sticks of dual rank or 4 sticks of single rank. Both will work totally fine because it's DDR5-8000. It's not hard. It's not hard. Oh, and by the way, memory training times for 4 sticks single rank is the same as 2 sticks dual rank. Just FYI. It's not like this is going to take a super long time to train. Now, the ones that take a long time to train is 4 sticks dual rank, which we're not talking about. No one's recommending that. That isn't even listed here. So we're not talking about dual rank 4 sticks. That's a whole different topic, which will be in a future video. So there's already videos on the channel for people that are curious about 128 and 192, because I get those questions all the time. Almost every time we talk about memory, someone always asks about 128 gigs of RAM or 192 gigs of RAM, and the answer is don't do it. There's like all the comments saying, 48 is overkill, 96 is overkill. Well, okay, I don't necessarily agree with those comments, but when it comes to 128 and 192, then I'll start saying, yeah, that's overkill. For a consumer desktop, 192 in particular is complete overkill. Unless you're doing like some kind of like heavy VM stuff, at that point, like, you better have a Ryzen 9 CPU, because it's like no one's gonna be doing 9800 X3D with like VMs and 192. That doesn't make any sense. So to me, like, the 192 gigabyte thing is kind of pointless unless there is a very, very specific reason that someone needs that much RAM. And even if they're doing that much memory, they have to come to terms with the fact that they're not going to necessarily be running the RAM at that fast speed. So, and not only that, but memory training times on dual rank, 4 sticks, 2 DPC, that is not fun. So just FYI. So that is a whole nother thing that requires patience. But that's another reason why we don't really recommend that kind of memory capacity on this channel. But any of these are fine. I just think, why settle for the lesser number when you can get the higher number for not that much more money? Matt, you were looking at getting 48. Yeah, I mean, that's good. That's good, but oh, well, yeah, you have the X670 Aorus Elite. I don't remember if that one can do DDR5-8000. I think it can, but I'm not 100% sure I remember. I know the Aorus Master can do DDR5-8000, but anyone looking at 48 gigs, I would recommend that you guys do research on whether or not your motherboard can handle DDR5-8000, because DDR5-8000 is legit, like, that is the best way to go. If you have a board that can do DDR5-8000, you're, with 48 gigs, you're better off with that than, like, you know, a lower speed with like lower cast latency because you get the natural synchronization benefit. And you can still do the whole TREFI mod, like, so all these people talking about, oh, well, you can tighten the latency on the, it's like, okay, I can run DDR5-8000, I can still run the TREFI maxed out if I want. It's not like it's going to change anything. Oh, and by the way, it's still running 1.35 volts, so to me, DDR5-8000 is the way to go, for at least for anyone who has a motherboard that can support that speed. It's definitely worth considering over like 6400 or whatever, because like the difference between the VSOC is like night and day. Like your idle power difference is like way better on DDR5-8000 versus DDR5-6400. So I can't stress that last point enough. So anyway, but see, that's where Ryzen gets that like those people saying that, oh, Ryzen has higher idle power. Well, that's because they're measuring it with like DDR5-6000 running at like VSOC 1.2 or whatever. I mean, that's literally the reason why it has higher idle power. If they were measuring the idle power with DDR5-8000 with like 1.0 or 1.1 VSOC, there's a huge reduction in the wattage there. So like there's just so many things about the DDR5-8000 that just kind of like, as someone who's tested all these different memory speeds, like, yeah, man, this is like, if you have a board that can support this is a no-brainer if you're looking for a 48 gigabyte kit. So either 32 gigs or 48, because see, I'm not recommending 64 until we see single rank 64 at this point. So it's either 48 and the next one up from 48 is 96. I mean, it's that simple. You're either doing 48 or you're doing 96. To me, those are numbers for 2025. Like 64 is okay. Like 30, like all these other numbers, they feel so old. Like 32 gigs feels so 2017 to me. Like, and 64 is like that's like 3 years ago or something. Like, I don't know, man. Like, no, it's not toxic. No. They're about the same. Assuming you can do 1.1 on 6400. Like, literally, 6400 1.1 is harder than DDR5-8000. The only requirement for DDR5-8000 is you have to have a really good motherboard. That's literally it. So, the answer is 8000 is better in general. But there are caveats there. Like, the main thing is literally you require a high-end board to pull that off. But no, DDR5-8000 is the best. It's best of the best. Like there's no arguing that. It's straight up better. I've tested them. It's better. So, the problem with 6400 is it's so finicky. It's CPU IMC dependent. It requires overclocking and manual tuning. DDR5-8000, you literally do nothing except load Expo and you're done. And you can even like lower the voltages if you want. So you can literally undervolt the VSOC on DDR5-8000. You cannot do that. In fact, you have to overvolt in all cases with DDR5-6400. Otherwise, it will not be stable in 1.1. Yeah, you cannot. That's why. Like, I hope I've been clear on this point, but basically the options are 48 gigabyte DDR5-8000, provided the motherboard can do it. Alternatively, DDR5-6000 up to 6400 in any of these configurations. And that's basically it. So if you need more memory, then you basically are going DDR5-6000 or 6400 or whatever. So, but if you are good with 48 and you want like best-in-class gaming experience, DDR5-8000. Recommendation RAM for 3D modeling and rendering. Any of these. Preferably this one or this one. That's the recommendation. That was an easy question. Um, I don't understand the whole thing. So Linux, how is that Microsoft's fault? The fact that you have to settle for 5600 on Linux, why? How is that a Microsoft problem? I don't understand. That doesn't make any sense. 2x24, 8000 if you've got the money for it, no doubt. Well, it's actually not that. Okay, yeah, compared to DDR5 6000, you are correct. DDR5 8000 is pricey compared to DDR5 6000. But if you're looking, basically what I'm saying is if you're considering DDR5 8000, don't settle for 32 gigabytes. If you're going to spend that much money for the premium DDR5 8000, you owe it to yourself to get the higher capacity, the 48 gigabyte. If you're going to go all the way in on DDR5 8000. Oh, another thing I want to point out. CUDIM. So CUDIM, guess what? CUDIM is all 48 gigabyte. All the CUDIM kits out there is currently 48 gigabyte kit, 2 times 24. So all those CUDIM that doesn't really do anything, there's not really much benefit right now. It's not practical because the voltages are too high as far as I'm concerned. I mean, a lot of those CUDIM kits, because I almost was thinking of getting a CUDIM kit to showcase that in bypass mode on the Godlike, as well as on my Intel 285K system to showcase CUDIM. I looked at the voltages, and a lot of the CUDIM kits are running 1.45 volts, which is like, that goes against like everything that I just said about voltage on RAM. So, no. CUDIM, unfortunately, is a thing. Again, it's like, I gotta give Intel the credit because Intel has been on the bleeding edge when it comes to, like, they were the first to introduce DDR5 CPUs with Alder Lake. And now, again, Intel is the first to introduce official support for CUDIM on desktop. However, like I said, they're too early because CUDIM is not that impressive. The voltage is way too high. It's expensive. It caps out at 48 gig kit, which is not a big deal. But we're talking like 1.45 volts for like 8600. I mean, that's like, or 8800. It's like, nah, man. That's like, what? Like, why? Like, why? So. What about like 48? Well, yeah, I guess. I mean, if it's always a discussion on cost, like if it's always like a pricing thing, then maybe DDR5 8000 is not the way to go because DDR5 8000 is inherently more expensive, and it is also more expensive when you look at the total build cost because it is very motherboard dependent. So there is that too. So yeah, the advantages of DDR5 6000 are definitely there. The fact that it works on every motherboard and it's lower cost, those are very strong advantages for DDR5 6000. Or I guess, I mean, 32 gigabyte, I don't buy that because it's like, I feel like 32, like if you're talking 32 gig 6000 versus 48 gig 6000, I don't think there's that much of a difference. Like, if you're talking like the same speed. So if you're, okay, I think Nero misunderstood me. When I said 32 gig versus 48, I'm talking 32 gig 8000. I'm talking 2x16. I'm talking about this. I'm not talking about 6000. So what I'm saying is, like, if you're going to consider DDR5 8000 at all, do not get the 32 gig kit. Get the 48 gig kit. If you're going to spend that much money for DDR5 8000 and you already have the motherboard that can pull it off, you're much better off just straight up spending the money to get the 48 gig kit. It's that simple. Like, this whole thing about, like, I don't understand where the 32 6000 versus that isn't even a proper comparison. Like, that isn't even a proper comparison because that's like you're talking apples and oranges. Like, that's like you're comparing to use the car analogy, that's like somebody comparing a Toyota Yaris to like a Toyota Camry. You know what I'm saying? Like that's like what? Like why this conversation doesn't make any sense. like 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 $100 bargain barrel DDR5 6000 32 gig versus like premium DDR5 8000 48 gig. Like really? Like that doesn't make any sense. You see what I'm saying? So, but yeah, the budget always, guys, the budget, of course. But this is a tech enthusiast channel, so we typically are talking about like the more like you're trying to extract better performance, but also trying to stay like cost does factor in. I mean, we literally listed cost as like a thing in this whole thing, so that is also there, but. Well, I think that's an exaggeration. That's not the right comparison. I wouldn't make that. That's too extreme of a comparison. Because the difference isn't really that great. So, it is faster though. I have done the test, guys. 2 to 5, yeah, exactly. It's not a lot, guys. It's not a lot for losing RAM. Like, you're not losing RAM. We're comparing speed. We're comparing speeds. We're not comparing like RAM capacities. Like what? Like what? Huh? Well, no, not necessarily. Like literally what we're saying is you take this kit, you load Expo and you're done. You take the 6000 kit, you load Expo, and you're done. You're not allowed to tune them. Now, how do they perform? You see what I'm saying? No, I know that's a joke, but I'm talking about a different comment. I'm responding to a different comment about like the whole like. At the end of the day, like Wizard's saying, 2 to 5% performance gain. Yeah, for losing 48 gig, like losing 48. Oh, you're talking about going from 96 to 48. Well, but see, that isn't the right way to look at it because you're thinking of two different use cases. You're comparing you're comparing a situation where someone actually needs 96 gigs versus someone who doesn't need or doesn't want 96 gigs, but wants the highest performance for gaming. Like you see, like, man, that's the problem with trying to keep up with all the comments. People are having so many sidebar conversations. It's so hard to keep up with all these different discussions. But anyway, guys, I think this was a good discussion, but it did drag out the stream by a whole another 46 minutes. Yeah, I think the RAM discussions are very interesting. We'll probably have more of them, but my general rule of thumb is no different from how it was last year. With the current memory technology, the choices are quite simple. You literally, like if you're doing single rank, the best optimal, this is, and take it from someone who has already tested 32 gig or like 6000 in a bunch of capacities, 8000 at 48 gigs, because that's like the highest capacity for 8000. And then like the 4 sticks, the 2 sticks, the single rank, the dual rank. I've tested all of it. So I have I would say I have a pretty good understanding of like what works well, what barely works, and what's not a good recommendation. And after all of the testing, the conclusion is no different from how it was last year. If you want true enthusiast performance, set it and forget it. You don't want to sit there tuning the memory. You just want to buy the very best. And you already have like a high-end motherboard that can already handle the speed. My top recommendation for a gaming build is 48 gigabytes DDR5 8000, provided you meet all the requirements to pull that off. That is not changing. That is still, from my own personal experience, testing a whole bunch of different memory, a whole bunch of different games, different motherboards, different CPUs, both Intel, both AMD. Like, this is still, like, the best choice overall. Like, it's the easiest, not on Intel, but it's the easiest on AMD, provided you have the board, and it's the best overall. Now, alternatives to this. The alternative to this is basically if you are if you don't have a motherboard that can do this, then the best choice is going to be the tried and true DDR5-6000 in whatever capacity you want if it's 2 sticks. So you can do 32 gigs, you can even do 24 gigs if you want. You can do 24 gigs, 32 gigs. Well, I don't think there's any 24. Is there 24? No, that's like 1 stick. Never mind. So you can do 32, 48, 64, 96, any of those, whatever. DDR5-6000, totally fine, whatever. That's the alternative to what I consider best in class. Best in class for a gaming PC is DDR5-8000 48 gigs. That does not change. Alternatives to that would be DDR5-6000 for people who have lower end motherboards or don't care to spend for DDR5-8000, but then like the whole capacity thing doesn't really make any sense because the 96 gigs at 6000 is more expensive than 48 gigs 8000. So you gotta be consistent with the comparisons here. So 6000 works for like literally any of these, including lower capacities like 48 and 32 gigabytes. If you're someone who, for whatever reason, believes that 32 gigabytes is totally enough for 2025, I mean, okay, that you're entitled to your opinion, but we'll see how that changes in the next 2 years with the way games are getting. So yeah, anyway, 6000 is the alternative, 8000 is the ideal. Now for workstation, for productivity, definitely 96 gigabytes is my top recommendation, either 4 24 gig DIMMs or 2 48 gig DIMMs. That doesn't change. I do not recommend anything above 96 gigabytes of memory because then you start sacrificing on speed of the memory. You are probably not going to run 6000, and unless you really, really know what you're doing. But again, we're talking about ease of use and practicality. It is very easy to do 4 sticks at 96 gigabytes capacity. If it was not easy to do, I literally wouldn't be streaming with a computer that has 4 sticks of 24 at 96 gig total at 6400 right now. If it was not easy to do. So, because I like things that are easy to pull off, easy to replicate, not some one-trick pony, oh, look at what I can do, but it's not practical, because that doesn't really, like, help the community. So, this is easy to do. So, I'm literally speaking from my own personal experience here. I really recommend 96 gigs for people who need the memory capacity. 96 gigs, either 2 or 4, it doesn't matter. They perform exactly the same. It's 4 single rank or 2 dual rank. It's literally the same thing in terms of latency and everything. So if one was better than the other, I'd be running the better one. But because they're literally the same, we literally have one computer running 2 times 48, and we have another computer running 4 times 24, and they perform exactly the same in the memory benchmarks. So total, the memory bandwidth is the same, the timings are the same, the TRFI is the same, everything's the same, voltage is the same, capacity is the same. The only difference is 4 sticks versus 2 sticks. So 4 single versus 2 dual. That's all it is. So it's very, very simple. But that is what I recommend if somebody wants higher capacity. In fact, I'll say highest capacity while still getting good speed, good low latency, while still managing a relatively high capacity at 96 gigabytes. So that is what I recommend for higher capacity. So again, 48 gigs or 96 gigs. Those are what I consider best in class in 2025. So that may change. Who knows if we can get a 64 gig kit with single rank that can run at 8000. That'll immediately change my recommendation, at least on the 48 gigabyte recommendation. But yeah, that's pretty much it for this stream, guys. So hopefully that was some useful information for people out there that are considering a new PC build this year. Whether you're upgrading from a old DDR4 or even a DDR3 system up to DDR5, there are some things to be aware of in typical like memory ratios, speeds, all that stuff. So hopefully this did help clarify some of that. Yeah, but that's gonna be it for this stream. I think we'll probably do one weekend live stream either tomorrow or the following evening. I don't know what I'm gonna do. Like the first Berserker Kazan literally came out. Inzoi's also out, but I don't have that game. I gotta look up like Inzoi. Is that actually good? Yeah, first Berserker Kazan is out as of now, and there's another game like AI Limit. I think was the other Souls-like that came out, similar to Kazan. It's another Souls-like game. So I don't know. We may do one of those, or we'll just stream Monster Hunter with a DDR4 system. Like all this stuff about DDR5, and then I go and I stream on a DDR4 system. Like we'll just probably stream Monster Hunter Wilds on a pandemic PC tomorrow or something like that. I don't know. We'll see. I'll think about it. I gotta think about it and see what we're gonna do. But anyway, guys, that's gonna be it for Tech Thursdays. If you're new to the channel, do get subscribed. It does help me out. If you want to tune in to these weekly live streams, we stream live every Thursdays. Pretty much guaranteed, I'll say. We're up to 103 episodes as of this one. So if you want to hit the bell icon to get notified when I go live. Sometimes we do live streams on the weekend as well. Those are more gaming centric. They're not necessarily tech focused, but if you tune into a weekend live stream and you ask a tech question, I mean, I'll be more than happy to answer it. So, I mean, sometimes we bust out Paint if we have to on the weekend if the question requires it. So, feel free to ask. It does help out the other viewers. People, I think, learn a lot from these streams. But anyway, that's going to be it. I'm going to go ahead and get out of here. Thank you all for tuning in. And if I don't see you guys either tomorrow or Saturday, I'll catch you on the next episode of Tech Thursdays next week. Until then, take care, and I will see you then. Thanks.